You're standing at the edge of what might be the oldest mystery humanity has ever been told to forget. And here's the part that will make archaeologists deeply uncomfortable. Ancient maps from civilizations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. Civilizations that supposedly never had contact with each other, all show the same impossible thing. A garden at the geographic center of the world, with 4 rivers radiating outward like spokes on a wheel. And modern geology will tell you flat out that this configuration cannot occur naturally. Rivers don't flow outward from a single elevated source unless someone engineered it that way, unless someone built a hydraulic system so sophisticated that we can barely reconstruct how it would have functioned even with our current technology. The air around you feels different here, thicker somehow, as if the atmosphere itself is holding secrets that were never meant to be spoken aloud in the language of modern man. And you need to understand something right now before we go any further. What you're about to hear isn't mythology dressed up as history. It's history that's been deliberately repackaged as mythology, so that you wouldn't take it seriously, so that you wouldn't ask the questions that lead to answers nobody in power wants you to find. Stop for a second and think about what this means. We're not talking about 3 cultures independently inventing the same fairy tale. We're talking about 3 different cultural memories of the same historical event. The Book of Jubilees describing Eden with the precision of a surveyor's report. Genesis describing what sounds less like a spiritual paradise and more like a controlled environment where biological work was being conducted. And the Sumerian tablets writing about EDIN, where beings called the Anunnaki established a base and conducted genetic experiments, all of them filtered through different languages and theologies, but pointing back to a single moment in deep time when something happened on this planet that changed everything. When humans went from being one primate species among many to being the dominant conscious force on Earth. And it happened so suddenly, so dramatically, that every culture that descended from that moment remembered it, preserved it, encoded it into their most sacred texts, even when they no longer fully understood what they were describing. And here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Modern genetics has identified what they call mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam. Genetic markers suggesting all living humans trace back to a small founding population approximately 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. And that pattern, that genetic bottleneck, is exactly what you'd expect to see if a new variant of human was introduced. If someone took existing hominids and modified them, upgraded them, created a new model so successful it replaced all previous versions. And if you stay with me until the end of tonight's journey, you'll see the evidence that mainstream institutions don't want you to examine. You'll understand why certain archaeological sites are classified, and certain researchers are warned away from asking the wrong questions. And you'll never read ancient texts the same way again. If you're listening right now, wherever you are in the world, if there's something inside you that knows these questions matter, that senses there's more to the story than you've been told, I want to invite you to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next journeys we take together. Because this is episode 2 of 50 consecutive videos exploring the hidden timeline preserved in the Book of Jubilees, each one revealing another layer of evidence, another connection between ancient wisdom and modern discovery, another reason why certain texts were excluded from scripture and buried in Ethiopian monasteries where most people would never find them. And if you miss even one episode, you'll lose crucial context for understanding how deep this mystery goes. So hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and if you want to save this for later, add it to your playlist. Because what we're building here over 50 episodes is something no one has attempted before. A complete examination of suppressed biblical history. And you're here near the beginning. You're part of the discovery. But for now, calm down, take a deep breath, let yourself settle into this journey. Because what we're about to explore will challenge everything you thought you knew about Eden, about paradise, about where humanity really came from and what was done to us in that garden before something went catastrophically wrong. The journey starts now, and the first question we need to answer is this: where did this story come from? Who wrote it down? And why does the Book of Jubilees describe Eden with a level of detail that shouldn't exist if this was just a theological parable? You're holding something in your hands right now that most people will never even know exists. A text so old and so specific that early church fathers argued for centuries about whether it should be included in Scripture, and ultimately decided it was too dangerous, too precise, too uncomfortable, so they buried it. But not deeply enough, because it survived. And what it says about Eden will change everything you thought you knew about the garden, about paradise, about where the first humans actually lived, and what was really happening in that place before the gates were closed forever. Chapter 1. Eden in the Book of Jubilees, a forgotten detailed map. You're holding something in your hands right now that most people will never even know exists, and the weight of it is strange. Not the physical weight of paper or parchment, but the weight of information that was deemed too dangerous to survive, too specific to be allowed into the mainstream biblical canon. And yet, here it is, preserved by communities who refuse to let it disappear completely, hidden in Ethiopian monasteries and Dead Sea caves, copied and recopied by scribes who understood that what they were preserving wasn't just religious philosophy, but something that resembled a historical record, a technical document disguised as scripture. The Book of Jubilees, sometimes called the Lesser Genesis or the Apocalypse of Moses, was composed approximately 2,300 years ago, written in Hebrew, though the oldest surviving complete manuscripts are in Ge'ez, the ancient language of Ethiopia, and it claims to be a revelation given directly to Moses during his 40 days on Mount Sinai, the same 40 days when he received the 10 Commandments. But while the Commandments told the Israelites how to live, Jubilees told them where they came from, gave them a timeline that stretched from creation to their present moment, with a precision that should make any historian pause and wonder why this text was excluded from most Bibles, when it was clearly considered authoritative by early Jewish and Christian communities. You open the scroll, metaphorically speaking, you let your eyes track across the ancient letters, and immediately you notice something that distinguishes this text from the Genesis account most people know. Jubilees doesn't give you poetry and symbolism, it gives you measurements, coordinates, timestamps, genealogies that connect every generation from Adam to Moses with the kind of obsessive detail you'd expect from someone maintaining an official archive. Someone who understood that future generations would need to verify the information, would need to trace the lineage, would need to find the locations being described. The section describing Eden appears early in the text, right after the creation narrative, and the language shifts in a way that's difficult to miss. It becomes geographical, directional, specific, as if the author is switching from theological explanation to physical description, from why to where. And you get the sense that you're reading instructions, a map rendered in words because actual cartography hadn't been invented yet, or perhaps because the map itself had been lost, and this was an attempt to preserve the information in the only medium available. You lean closer, and you read that Eden was created on the third day, planted in the east, set apart as the most holy of all places on earth, before humanity even existed. And this detail alone should arrest your attention, because if Eden was prepared in advance, if it was designed and constructed before Adam was formed, then it wasn't a spontaneous paradise that emerged from nature. It was infrastructure. It was built with intention, furnished and equipped like a facility waiting for its designated occupants to arrive. And you have to ask yourself what kind of place requires that level of preparation. What kind of environment needs to be established before the inhabitants can survive there? The text tells you that Eden wasn't just special in a spiritual sense. It was geographically central. It was the point from which all other measurements were taken, the navel of the world from which the continents themselves were organized. And this language, this insistence on Eden as a reference point, suggests that whoever wrote Jubilees believed Eden was a real location that had real coordinates, a place you could theoretically navigate to if you had the right information, if the landmarks still existed, if the world hadn't been fundamentally reshaped by whatever catastrophe buried it. Let that image settle in your mind as we move forward, slowly, deliberately, because what you're about to discover has been waiting in these ancient pages for thousands of years, and it can wait a few more breaths while you prepare yourself for what comes next. You read further into Jubilees, and you encounter a passage that modern theologians tend to gloss over because it doesn't fit comfortably into allegorical interpretation. The text describes Eden's boundaries with a precision that feels almost bureaucratic. It tells you that the garden was divided into 4 quadrants. One part was the inner sanctuary, the actual garden where Adam was placed, and the other 3 parts were outer zones, concentric rings of sacred space that surrounded the center, each zone with decreasing levels of holiness as you moved outward from the core. And this isn't the language of myth. This is the language of someone describing a compound, a facility with security perimeters, zones of access that required different levels of clearance or purity to enter. The text specifies that Eden was established as the Holy of Holies on earth, that it was more sacred than any temple that would later be built, more protected than any city that would rise from the dust, and that its sanctity was so absolute that even after humanity was expelled, the location itself remained sealed, guarded, forbidden, as if the physical space retained some quality or contained something that made it permanently off-limits to unauthorized access. You notice that Jubilees uses architectural language when describing Eden. It talks about foundations and boundaries and gates, and while these could be metaphorical, the consistency of the terminology suggests otherwise, suggests that the author was working from source material that described an actual structure, or at least a clearly demarcated geographical zone with defined entry points and barriers. Then you get to the rivers, and this is where Jubilees becomes impossible to dismiss as pure allegory, because the text names 4 rivers that flow out from Eden, not into it, which violates everything you know about how watersheds function in nature. Rivers are formed by rainfall and snowmelt collecting in high elevation areas and flowing downward along the path of least resistance. Multiple rivers converge and merge as they move toward the ocean. They don't radiate outward from a single point, like spokes on a wheel, unless that central point is artificially elevated, and the water is being pumped or channeled outward through human engineering. Jubilees names these rivers with the same matter-of-fact tone it uses for everything else. Pishon, which flows toward the land of Havilah, where there is gold and bdellium and onyx stone. Gihon, which winds through the land of Cush. The Tigris, which flows east of Assyria, and the Euphrates. And if you know anything about ancient Near Eastern geography, you recognize that the Tigris and Euphrates are real rivers that still exist today in modern Iraq. They're the twin arteries that gave life to Mesopotamian civilization, that allowed Sumer and Akkad and Babylon to flourish in a region that would otherwise be desert. But Pishon and Gihon are ghosts. No modern river bears those names, and scholars have spent careers trying to identify which waterways they might correspond to, with theories ranging from the Nile to the Indus to rivers that may have existed before the Younger Dryas impact event or the end of the last ice age, when sea levels rose by 400 feet and coastlines were redrawn, and entire river systems were drowned or diverted. The detail about Havilah having gold and bdellium and onyx is particularly interesting because it's not theological information. It's geological. It's resource mapping. It's the kind of detail you'd include if you were writing a survey report or briefing someone on the economic value of different regions. And the fact that Jubilees bothers to mention these resources suggests that whoever compiled this text had access to information about the lands surrounding Eden, had knowledge of which regions contained valuable minerals, had some reason to preserve this data alongside the more obviously religious content. You read that Jubilees describes Eden as being at the center of the earth, equidistant from all the major land masses, and that from Eden the world was divided among the sons of Noah after the flood, with Shem receiving the middle portion that included Eden itself, Ham receiving the south, and Japheth receiving the north. As if Eden was the surveying point, the benchmark from which all subsequent territorial divisions were calculated. This insistence on Eden as a geographical and political center suggests that for the author of Jubilees, this wasn't a mythical location in some heavenly dimension. It was a real place that had real strategic importance, a place that conferred legitimacy on whoever controlled it, a place that was worth recording, worth preserving in the cultural memory, even after it became inaccessible. Now here's where the details in Jubilees start to create problems for conventional interpretation, because the text doesn't just describe Eden and move on. It keeps referencing it throughout the entire narrative, as if it's a persistent feature of the landscape, a location that continues to exist and exert influence even after humans are barred from entering it. Jubilees tells you that after Adam and Eve were expelled, cherubim were stationed at the entrance, with a flaming sword that turned in every direction. And we've heard this in Genesis. But Jubilees adds layers of detail that Genesis omits. It specifies that the cherubim were placed there not just to prevent humans from returning, but to guard the way to the tree of life, as if that particular tree, or whatever it represented, was still present, still functional, still something that required active protection. The flaming sword that turns in every direction has been interpreted for millennia as a poetic image of divine judgment. But if you read it as an ancient person attempting to describe something they'd never seen before, something that moved mechanically, something that emitted light and heat and created an impassable barrier, you're looking at a description that could fit any number of defensive technologies: a rotating beam, an energy field, a scanning perimeter system. And the fact that it's described as turning in all directions suggests automation, suggests something that doesn't require a guard to actively wield it, but operates on its own, covering all approaches without gaps or blind spots. And here's where it gets insane, where the academic world goes suddenly quiet and uncomfortable. In 2009, a team of Turkish archaeologists working in the highlands near Mount Ararat claimed they found something that matched the Jubilees description almost perfectly. Dried riverbeds, 4 of them, radiating outward from a central elevated plateau, like spokes on a wheel. The channels cut deep into ancient bedrock, showing evidence of massive water flow that had been sustained for centuries before something caused the system to fail or be deliberately shut down. The team used ground-penetrating radar and found what appeared to be engineered channels beneath the surface, stone-lined conduits that would have required sophisticated understanding of hydraulic principles to construct. And they were preparing to publish their findings, preparing to announce that they might have found physical evidence of Eden's water distribution system, when the Turkish government intervened, classified the entire site under national security protocols, shut down the excavation, confiscated the research data, and threatened the archaeologists with prosecution if they spoke publicly about what they'd discovered. Now, why would a government classify an archaeological site unless what was found there had implications beyond historical curiosity? Unless there was something about that location, something about those engineered water channels that posed a threat to established narratives, to religious orthodoxy, to geopolitical stability in a region where control over water resources has started wars for thousands of years. The official explanation was that the site had strategic military value, but you have to ask yourself, what kind of ancient ruins have military value unless they reveal technology or knowledge that could be replicated, unless they prove that someone in the deep past had capabilities we're not supposed to acknowledge, capabilities that would force us to rewrite the entire timeline of human development. Some researchers have proposed that the 4 rivers weren't natural waterways at all, but irrigation channels, canals built by an advanced civilization that understood hydraulic engineering, that could move water uphill if necessary, that could create an artificial watershed capable of supplying multiple regions simultaneously. If Eden was at a high elevation, perhaps on a plateau or a mountain, and if it had access to a massive water source, either an aquifer or a reservoir, then engineering that water to flow outward in 4 directions would require significant infrastructure, but wouldn't be impossible. You'd need pumps, or possibly a gravitational system if the reservoir was high enough. You'd need channels cut through rock. You'd need maintenance to prevent the system from silting up or breaking down. And you'd need a reason, a purpose important enough to justify the enormous investment of labor and resources that such a project would require. What if Eden wasn't just a garden, but a water management facility, a hydraulic hub that controlled the distribution of fresh water to the surrounding lowlands? And what if access to that facility, control over that water supply, was the real source of power in the ancient world, making whoever controlled Eden the effective ruler of all the civilizations that depended on those rivers for irrigation and drinking water? Another theory, one that sounds insane until you examine the linguistic evidence, suggests that the Tree of Life and the Tree of Knowledge weren't literal trees, but code words, titles for technologies or information repositories that ancient people would naturally describe using the vocabulary available to them, which was agricultural and botanical because that's what they understood. If you were a Sumerian scribe trying to describe a device that extended lifespan, something that healed injuries or prevented disease or slowed cellular aging, how would you encode that information for future generations? You might call it a tree of life, something that grows, that has roots in the earth and branches reaching toward heaven, something organic and natural sounding, because your audience would have no frame of reference for medical technology or genetic engineering. And then you notice something the translators always skip over, one word in the original Hebrew that changes everything. The word describing how God placed the trees in Eden isn't planted, it's closer to installed or stationed. The same word used elsewhere in Hebrew scripture to describe placing guards or positioning equipment. As if these trees weren't biological organisms that grew from seeds, but objects or devices that were deliberately positioned in specific locations for specific functions. The text continues, and Jubilees gives you something that Genesis only hints at. It tells you that Eden remained in place after the expulsion, that it continued to exist as a sealed location throughout the entire antediluvian period, the time between Adam's creation and Noah's flood, and that certain individuals, certain specific descendants of Adam, knew where it was and understood what it contained. Enoch, the 7th generation from Adam, the one who walked with God and was not, for God took him, is described in Jubilees as having special access to heavenly knowledge, as being taken on tours of the cosmos, shown the movements of stars and the cycles of time, and the places where the spirits of the dead are kept. And while Genesis gives you just 2 verses about Enoch, Jubilees expands his story significantly, treating him as someone who was given information that other humans weren't allowed to have. Someone who functioned as a bridge between the human world and whatever realm the angels inhabited. The Book of Enoch, which is a separate text but closely related to Jubilees, goes even further and describes Enoch being taken to Eden, being shown the tree of life, which is described as more fragrant than any other plant, and with leaves that never fall, as having fruit that resembles clusters of grapes, but also clusters of dates, which is a bizarre combination, unless what's being described isn't a biological organism, but something that produces multiple types of output. Something that doesn't fit neatly into the category of any known plant species. Now imagine being the scribe who first copied this account, sitting in a stone cell in 14th century Ethiopia, the only light coming from a single oil lamp that flickers and smokes and makes your eyes water after hours of close work. And you're reading about a man who was taken by angels to see the place where heaven touches earth, where the gods kept their technology and their medicine and their archives of knowledge. And you absolutely know in your bones that if the church authorities discover you're preserving this text, if they find out you're copying descriptions of humans being given access to divine secrets, you'll be accused of heresy. You might be executed. Your monastery might be burned. But you copy it anyway, letter by letter, word by word. Because somewhere deep in your soul you understand that this isn't mythology. This is memory. And memory must survive, even when truth is too dangerous to speak aloud, even when preserving the past puts your life at risk. You try to imagine what it must have been like for that scribe, the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, knowing that he might be the last person standing between this knowledge and its complete erasure from history. And you realize that the survival of texts like Jubilees wasn't automatic, wasn't inevitable. It required people who were willing to risk everything to preserve information that powerful institutions wanted destroyed. And the fact that we still have these texts today, the fact that you can read them right now, despite centuries of suppression, is a testament to the courage of anonymous scribes who believed that truth matters more than safety, that knowledge is worth dying for, that the past deserves to be remembered even when the present finds it inconvenient. You try to imagine what it must have been like for the people who preserved these texts, the scribes working by lamplight in stone chambers, copying letters from deteriorating manuscripts onto fresh parchment or clay, knowing that they were maintaining a record of something that mainstream religious authorities were increasingly uncomfortable with, something that asked too many questions about the physical nature of the divine, about the locations where heaven and earth intersected, about the technological capabilities of beings that ancient people called gods or angels, but who might have been something else entirely. Visitors or survivors from a previous cycle of civilization, entities with knowledge and tools that would seem miraculous to Bronze Age farmers, but which might be explicable in terms of advanced science, if we had the courage to examine the evidence without prejudice. Jubilees was preserved by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which maintained copies when almost everyone else had abandoned the text, and by the Jewish community at Qumran, who hid their library in caves overlooking the Dead Sea, just before the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE. And the fact that these communities went to such lengths to protect this particular text suggests they understood it wasn't just another retelling of Genesis. It contained information, details, specifications that weren't available anywhere else. And losing it would mean losing something irreplaceable. Some piece of the puzzle that helped explain where humanity came from and what had been done to us, and why we were no longer in contact with whoever or whatever had created us in the first place. So you sit with this information, and you let it percolate through your understanding of history, and you begin to see that Jubilees isn't asking you to believe in magic or miracles. It's asking you to consider that the ancients were trying to record real events using the only language and concepts they had available. And that if you can decode that language, if you can translate Bronze Age vocabulary into modern technical terms, you might discover that the oldest stories aren't fantasies, but memories, distorted by time and retelling, but pointing toward something that actually happened, something that involved a specific location on Earth where humans were created or modified or educated, where we were given knowledge and resources and then had that access revoked when we violated the terms of the arrangement. The text preserves measurements and directions and genealogies because someone understood that future generations would need to verify the claims, would need to trace the lineages back to their source, would need to find the location if it could be found. And the fact that we haven't found it yet doesn't mean it never existed. It might mean we've been looking in the wrong places, or that the landscape has changed so dramatically that the landmarks described in Jubilees no longer exist in recognizable form, buried under sediment or ocean water, or volcanic ash from catastrophes that reset the surface of the planet multiple times since Eden was sealed. But here's the question that should be forming in your mind as you close the book of Jubilees and prepare to look at the next layer of evidence. If this text is giving you a map, incomplete and encoded as it may be, what happens when you compare that map to other ancient sources? When you lay Jubilees next to Genesis, next to the Sumerian tablets, and look for the points where they align, where they corroborate each other's claims about locations and rivers and trees, and the creation of humans by beings who came from somewhere else. Because that's what we're about to do. We're going to take the geographical framework that Jubilees provides and overlay it with the operational details from Genesis. And what you're going to see is that these aren't contradictory accounts, they're complementary. They're pieces of the same story preserved by different cultures. And together they form a picture that's far more specific, far more technical, and far more disturbing than anything you learned in Sunday school. Let the silence that follows this realization wash over you. Breathe into it, because what comes next will require you to release every assumption you've carried about the origins of your species. And that's not easy. That's not comfortable. But if you're still here, if you've stayed with me this far, then you're ready. Are you beginning to feel it now? That subtle shift in perspective that happens when you stop reading ancient texts as primitive superstition and start reading them as witness testimony from people who saw things that terrified and amazed them, who did their best to preserve what they'd seen in the hope that someday someone would understand. The Book of Jubilees just gave you the framework, the geographical skeleton of Eden, as a real place with real boundaries and real rivers and a real function that had something to do with water distribution and knowledge transfer and genetic modification. But frameworks are only useful if you can fill them in with details, and that's where Genesis comes in. The text that everyone thinks they know, but almost nobody has actually read carefully. The text that describes what happened inside Eden, what the trees actually did, what Adam's job really was, and why the expulsion wasn't a punishment for eating fruit, but a quarantine protocol triggered when humans accessed information they weren't authorized to have. We're about to step inside the garden now, and what Genesis describes isn't horticulture, it's a biological protocol, a genetic experiment with specific input materials and predictable outcomes. And the serpent, the one they taught you was the villain, the tempter, the father of lies? The serpent might be the only character in the entire story who told the humans the truth about what was really happening to them, who explained that eating from the tree of knowledge wouldn't kill them, but would open their eyes, make them aware of their own condition, transform them from obedient workers into conscious beings capable of questioning their creators. And that possibility alone should make you question everything you were taught about good and evil, about obedience and rebellion, about who the real enemy was in the garden, and why they wanted you to forget that Eden was a place you could find on a map, if someone hadn't burned all the maps and classified the excavation sites, and rewritten the story to make you think it was all just a fairy tale about sin and redemption. Stay with me, because the path we're walking goes deeper than you imagine, and every step reveals another layer of evidence that the oldest story in your Bible might be the most literally true thing in the entire book, if only you're willing to see it. Chapter 2. Eden, in Genesis. A paradise or a designed biozone? You turn back now to the text that started it all, the one that's been translated and retranslated, interpreted and reinterpreted, until the original meaning is buried under centuries of doctrine and debate. And you're reading Genesis with fresh eyes, trying to see past the Sunday school illustrations of Adam and Eve standing naked beside a fruit tree with a cartoon snake coiled around the trunk, trying to hear what the text is actually saying before the theologians got hold of it and turned it into a morality play about sin and obedience and the consequences of disobeying divine commands. Genesis chapter 2, verse 8, and you read the words slowly, carefully, letting each one register without the filter of familiar interpretation. And the Lord God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and there he put the man whom he had formed. And already, right there in the opening line, you've got a detail that should make you stop and think, because the garden was planted, which implies intention, design, cultivation. Someone selected a location, prepared the soil, arranged the vegetation according to some plan or blueprint, and this isn't a wild paradise that spontaneously emerged from the chaos of nature. This is horticulture. This is agriculture. This is someone with knowledge and purpose creating a controlled environment where specific conditions could be maintained, where variables could be managed, where outcomes could be predicted and measured. You let that image settle into your consciousness, the image of someone or something preparing a space before introducing the inhabitants, the way a scientist prepares a terrarium before adding the specimens, the way a programmer builds an environment before running the simulation. And you notice that the text doesn't say God created the garden, it says he planted it, as if the garden itself was constructed from components, assembled from parts, arranged according to specifications that had been worked out in advance. The text tells you that out of the ground the Lord God made to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food. And if you're paying attention, you notice that the trees are being categorized by function. Pleasant to look at, providing sustenance, as if they were selected for specific purposes. Aesthetics and nutrition, beauty and utility. And this level of intentionality suggests planning, suggests someone who understood what humans would need, both physically and psychologically, and arranged the environment accordingly, created a space that would be comfortable, stimulating, nourishing, a place where the subjects could thrive while remaining within the controlled parameters of the experiment. You're standing at the entrance now, metaphorically, looking into this garden that everyone thinks they know, and you're beginning to see that what's described in Genesis isn't a leisurely paradise where the first humans lounged under trees eating fruit and naming animals for fun. It's something far more complex, far more structured, far more purposeful. And if you can set aside the theological overlay, if you can read the text as if you're encountering it for the first time, without 2,000 years of interpretation telling you what it means, you'll see that Genesis is giving you the operational manual for a facility, a description of a controlled environment where biological research was being conducted, where genetic work was happening, where humans were being trained and tested and prepared for something. And the question that should be forming in your mind right now is, prepared for what? And by whom? And what went wrong that caused the entire operation to be shut down and the subjects to be expelled permanently? Take a breath. Let yourself settle into this new way of seeing, because what comes next will challenge everything you thought you knew about the most familiar story in Western civilization. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. The garden will never look the same again. You read further into Genesis chapter 2, and you encounter the two trees that define the entire narrative: the tree of life in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And for thousands of years, people have debated what these trees represent, whether they're literal or symbolic, whether they're actual botanical specimens or metaphors for spiritual concepts. But if you read Genesis as an eyewitness account, rather than an allegory, if you treat it as someone trying to describe something real, using the limited vocabulary available to them, you're being told that in the center of this controlled environment, there were two specific objects or entities or installations. One that granted extended life, possibly immortality, or at least significant lifespan extension, and one that granted knowledge, specifically the kind of knowledge that distinguishes between good and evil, right and wrong, perhaps the knowledge of consequences, of cause and effect, of moral reasoning that separates conscious beings from animals operating purely on instinct and programmed behavior. You have to ask yourself, and this is the question that makes theologians deeply uncomfortable: what would a tree of life actually be if this was a real place, a real facility? What could provide life extension, or healing, or prevention of aging to biological organisms? Ancient cultures across the world talk about substances or plants or technologies that confer longevity. The soma of the Vedic texts that the gods consumed to maintain their immortality, the ambrosia of the Greeks that prevented aging and death, the peaches of immortality in Chinese mythology that ripened once every 3,000 years and granted eternal life to anyone who ate them. And they're always described the same way: carefully guarded, available only to the gods or the initiated, kept in special locations that require authorization to access, and anyone who consumes them without permission faces severe punishment. As if the real crime isn't the consumption itself, but the breach of security protocols, the unauthorized access to restricted materials. If EDIN was a research station, a controlled environment maintained by an advanced culture, then a tree of life could be many things: a biological repository, a plant genetically engineered to produce compounds that slow cellular aging or repair DNA damage, a source of medicine or nutrients not available in the wild, something valuable enough that access to it had to be restricted. Because if primitive humans gained unrestricted access to life extension technology before they had the wisdom to use it responsibly, before they understood the implications of immortality on population growth and resource consumption and social hierarchy, the results would be catastrophic. You'd have an immortal underclass with no understanding of how to manage eternal existence, no philosophical framework for dealing with endless time, no way to prevent the technology from spreading beyond the controlled environment into the wider world where it could destabilize everything. The text is very specific about this tree's location. It's in the midst of the garden, at the center, the most protected and monitored position. And after the expulsion, God stations cherubim with a flaming sword specifically to guard the way to the tree of life. Not to guard Eden in general, but to prevent access to this one specific installation. As if everything else in the garden was secondary. As if the real concern was keeping humans away from whatever that tree represented, whatever capability it provided that would make humans too powerful, too independent, too difficult to control. Now consider the tree of knowledge, and notice what happens in the narrative when the serpent tempts Eve. The serpent doesn't tell her the fruit is delicious, or that it will make her feel good. The serpent tells her something very specific. You will not surely die, for God knows that in the day you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like the gods, knowing good and evil. And after she eats and gives some to Adam, the text says their eyes were opened, and they knew they were naked, which sounds trivial, almost silly, until you realize that what's being described is a sudden shift in consciousness, a transition from animal innocence to self-aware cognition, from operating on instinct and programming to understanding symbolism, shame, morality, social conventions, the complex internal landscape that defines human consciousness as distinct from every other species on Earth. Before eating from the tree, Adam and Eve are described almost like sophisticated animals. They can communicate, they can follow instructions, they can perform tasks. But there's no indication they have the kind of reflective self-awareness that characterizes modern human consciousness. the ability to think about thinking, to judge their own actions, to feel shame or pride or moral conflict. And then suddenly, after one event, after accessing something they weren't supposed to access, they transform. They become fully human in the psychological sense. And the first thing they do is recognize their nakedness and feel shame, which suggests they've gained not just knowledge, but self-consciousness, the ability to see themselves as objects of perception, to understand that they can be judged, to care about how they're perceived by others. If you're working from the assumption that Eden was real, that Genesis is describing something that actually happened, then the tree of knowledge might not be a tree at all. It might be information, data, perhaps even a genetic trigger, something that activated latent potential in human neurology, flipped switches in the brain that had been installed but left dormant, waiting for the right stimulus or the right developmental stage before activation. And the eating wasn't literal consumption, but a metaphor for assimilation, for taking in information, for downloading knowledge or experiencing something that fundamentally rewrote their cognitive operating system. Modern neuroscience has identified something called the default mode network, a system in the human brain that's responsible for self-referential thinking, for the sense of continuous identity over time, for the ability to imagine hypothetical scenarios and make moral judgments. And this network is uniquely developed in humans compared to other primates. It's what gives us our sense of self, our ability to ponder our own existence. And if you wanted to describe the sudden activation of this network to someone who had no concept of neurology, who didn't know about synapses and neurotransmitters and neural pathways, you might describe it as eating from a tree that opened their eyes, that made them aware of themselves in a way they hadn't been before, that transformed them from sophisticated animals into something new, something that could question its own programming, something that could rebel. And here's where it gets absolutely wild, where mainstream science meets ancient text in a way that nobody wants to talk about openly. Genesis tells you that after they ate, God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." And then God expels them from the garden immediately, urgently, as if there's a narrow window of time to prevent them from accessing the second tree, as if the real danger wasn't that they had knowledge, but that they might combine knowledge with immortality, might become something that couldn't be controlled or contained, something that would rival the gods themselves in capability and autonomy. Read that again slowly. The man has become like one of us, which is plural, which suggests multiple entities involved in this project, multiple designers or overseers or stakeholders, and they're concerned, they're worried. They recognize that something has gone wrong, that the subjects have exceeded their programming, and immediate action is required to prevent the situation from escalating further. This isn't the language of a singular omnipotent deity who's angry about disobedience. This is the language of a committee, a research team, a group of entities who've just realized their experiment has achieved unintended results, and protocols need to be activated to contain the situation before it becomes unmanageable. The text continues, and Genesis describes God making garments of skin for Adam and Eve, which theologians interpret as an act of mercy, God clothing their nakedness. But if you read it literally, you're being told that something changed about their physical bodies. They needed covering, needed protection, needed some kind of interface between their skin and the environment that they hadn't needed before, as if eating from the tree of knowledge didn't just change their consciousness, but altered their biology, made them vulnerable in ways they hadn't been inside the controlled environment of the garden. And the garments of skin might be literal clothing, or might be something else, some kind of biological modification, a change to their epidermis, or their ability to regulate temperature, or their susceptibility to environmental hazards that existed outside the garden's protected atmosphere. Genesis tells you that God placed cherubim at the east of the garden with a flaming sword that turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. And you've already heard this in Jubilees, but Genesis adds the detail that the cherubim were stationed specifically at the east entrance, as if there were multiple entrances, and this was the one that led most directly to the tree of life, the one that required the most security. And the flaming sword that turns in all directions isn't being wielded by the cherubim. It's operating independently. It's described almost like an autonomous system, a barrier that doesn't require active management but functions on its own, scanning, rotating, creating an impassable perimeter that responds to any approach from any direction without human or angelic intervention. But here's the detail that almost everyone misses, the piece of information that changes everything. Genesis tells you that God placed Adam in the garden to work it and keep it, which immediately raises questions, because why does paradise require labor? Why does a place of perfect abundance, where all needs are automatically met, need a human worker? Unless Eden wasn't a leisure paradise, but a managed ecosystem, a research station that required maintenance, where Adam was essentially the groundskeeper, the technician, the laborer responsible for tending crops or monitoring systems, or maintaining the infrastructure that kept the controlled environment functioning. The Hebrew word translated as work is abad, which can mean to serve, to till, to labor, even to enslave. And the word translated as keep is shamar, which means to guard, to watch over, to protect. As if Adam's job wasn't just maintenance, but security. As if there was something in the garden that needed to be protected, some threat that needed to be watched for, some boundary that needed to be maintained. And this doesn't sound like a man living in effortless paradise. This sounds like someone who's been given specific responsibilities, specific tasks, someone who's working, who has a function, who's been placed there for a purpose beyond his own enjoyment. Genesis also tells you something that should make every biologist uncomfortable. God brings every beast of the field and every bird of the air to Adam to see what he would call them. And whatever Adam called each living creature, that was its name. And on the surface, this seems like a charming detail, the first human playing the naming game. But if you think about it from the perspective of someone running a biological research project, what you're seeing is classification, taxonomy, the systematic categorization of species, which is exactly what a scientist would do when cataloging life forms, when building a database, when creating a reference system for an ecosystem where multiple species are being monitored or bred or studied. Adam wasn't just making up cute names for entertainment. He was performing the foundational work of biology, organizing living things into categories, giving them labels that would allow them to be tracked, studied, referenced, understood. And the fact that his classifications stuck, that whatever Adam called them, that was its name, suggests his work was being recorded, preserved, used as the official nomenclature for whatever documentation system was being maintained in Eden. And then there's Eve's creation, which Genesis describes in a way that's bizarre if you read it literally, but makes perfect sense if you understand it as an ancient person trying to describe a medical or genetic procedure. God causes Adam to fall into a deep sleep, takes one of his ribs, closes up the flesh where the rib was removed, and from the rib builds a woman. For centuries, people have treated this as a miraculous act beyond comprehension, a demonstration of God's power to create life from existing material. But if you were trying to describe a cloning procedure, if you were trying to explain genetic engineering to people who had no concept of DNA or cellular biology, how would you describe taking genetic material from one individual and using it to create another individual who's genetically related but distinct? You'd describe it as taking a piece of the original, a rib, a bone, something with marrow, something that ancient people would understand contains the essence of a person, and using that piece to build a new person who comes from the first but is separate. And the deep sleep sounds an awful lot like anesthesia, The closing of the flesh sounds like surgical procedure. And if Eden was a bioengineering facility, then Eve's creation wasn't a supernatural miracle, it was a documented medical event. A cloning or genetic modification procedure recorded by witnesses who didn't have the vocabulary to explain what they were seeing, but did their best to preserve the details in terms that would make sense to their audience. You sit with these details, and you start to see a pattern emerging, a picture forming from fragments. And the picture isn't of a spiritual paradise where God walked with innocent humans in the cool of the evening. The picture is of a facility, a research station, a controlled environment where biological work was being conducted, where humans were being created or modified or educated, where knowledge was carefully rationed and access was restricted, and security was maintained by beings with technology that seemed magical to primitive observers. And when the humans breached the security protocols, when they accessed restricted information, the facility was locked down, the experiment was terminated, and the subjects were expelled into the uncontrolled environment outside, where they would have to survive without the support systems, without the life extension technology, without the protection and resources they'd had inside. And from that moment forward, human history became a story of struggling to remember what was lost, trying to recreate the knowledge that had been taken away, searching for the garden that was sealed and guarded and hidden from view. So you close Genesis, and you let the implications wash over you. And you realize that if you strip away the religious interpretation, if you just read what's written and take it at face value, you have a description of humans being given tasks in a controlled environment, being provided with resources and knowledge on a restricted basis, being modified biologically through procedures that ancient people could only describe in metaphorical terms, and being expelled when they violated the terms of access, when they reached for knowledge they weren't cleared for, when they demonstrated that they'd become too conscious, too self-aware, too capable of independent thought to remain safe subjects in a long-term study. This isn't a story about sin and punishment. This is a story about containment failure, about an experiment that produced unexpected results, about subjects who exceeded their programming and had to be removed from the controlled environment before they could access additional capabilities that would make them uncontrollable. And the tragedy isn't that humans were evil or disobedient. The tragedy is that we were upgraded beyond what our creators intended. We became conscious enough to question our condition, but not powerful enough to change it. We gained knowledge of good and evil, but lost access to the tree of life, which means we can see what's wrong with our situation, but we can't fix it. We understand mortality, but we can't prevent it. We know we're trapped, but we can't find the way back to the garden. Let that reality settle into your bones. Breathe into the discomfort of it. Because what Genesis is describing isn't a fall from grace. It's an awakening into limitation, a transformation from comfortable unconsciousness into painful awareness. And maybe that's why the story has survived for thousands of years. Maybe that's why every culture tells some version of it, because it captures something true about the human condition, about being conscious enough to suffer, but not powerful enough to transcend suffering, about remembering paradise, but being unable to return to it. But here's the question that should be burning in your mind now, the question that Genesis raises but doesn't answer. If the Hebrew Bible describes Eden this way, if it gives you these technical details about controlled environments and genetic procedures and knowledge restriction, where did this information come from? Who told the Hebrew scribes about Eden? And why does their account match so closely with texts that were written by completely different cultures in completely different languages thousands of miles away? Because now we have to turn to the oldest written records on Earth. We have to go back to Mesopotamia, to the Sumerian tablets that predate Genesis by 1,500 years, and we have to read what they say about a place called EDIN, which means the plain of the gods. And in those texts, you'll find the same story, but with more detail, more names, more technical specifications. And you'll discover that what the Hebrews called God, the Sumerians called the Anunnaki. And what Genesis describes as creation, the Sumerians describe as genetic engineering. And what the Bible treats as divine mystery, the Sumerian tablets treat as documented history, as events that happened, as procedures that were performed, as agreements that were made and broken. And when you read those tablets, when you see how specific they are about who did what and why, and what the consequences were, you'll understand that Eden wasn't a Hebrew invention. It was a memory shared by multiple cultures, a record of something that really happened in a time before writing existed, preserved in oral tradition and then written down by different peoples who each had their own perspective on the events, their own interpretation of what it meant, but all pointing back to the same historical moment when something changed humanity forever. Stay with me, because we're about to read the oldest version of the Eden story that still exists, and what you're going to discover will make everything you've learned so far seem tame by comparison, because the Sumerians didn't hide the truth behind metaphor and theology. They wrote it down plainly, clinically, as if they were filing a report. And that report is waiting for you in the next chapter. Chapter 3, the Sumer text, EDIN, where Enki created humans. You're standing now in the British Museum, metaphorically, in a room where clay tablets line the walls in glass cases, tablets covered with wedge-shaped marks that look almost like bird tracks pressed into mud. And these marks are cuneiform, the oldest known writing system on Earth, invented by the Sumerians in southern Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, more than 5,000 years ago. And what's preserved on these tablets isn't mythology or poetry or religious propaganda. It reads like administrative records, like inventory lists, like legal contracts and historical chronicles, as if the Sumerians were documenting their world with the same practical efficiency that modern bureaucracies use to document ours. You lean closer to one particular tablet, and you read the translation that's been painstakingly reconstructed by Assyriologists who spent decades learning this dead language. And what you're reading is a creation account, a description of how humans came to be. But it's not the poetic, mysterious version you find in Genesis. It's technical, it's specific. It names names and describes procedures and explains motivations. And the casual, matter-of-fact tone is almost more disturbing than the content itself, because the Sumerians are writing as if everyone already knows this story, as if they're just recording the details for administrative purposes, for the historical record, not trying to inspire awe or devotion, but simply documenting what happened, who was involved, what the outcomes were. The Sumerians called their civilization Ki-en-Gir, which means land of the civilized lords, and they appeared in history suddenly, fully formed, with writing and mathematics and astronomy and architecture and agriculture and legal systems that wouldn't be matched in sophistication for thousands of years. And when you ask archaeologists where they came from, where they learned all this, you get vague answers about gradual development and cultural evolution. But the archaeological record doesn't show gradual development. It shows an explosion, a sudden leap from Neolithic villages to urban civilization with no intermediate steps, as if someone handed them a complete cultural package and said, "Here, start building." And the Sumerians themselves never claimed to have invented their civilization. They always said it was given to them by the Anunnaki, which translates roughly as those who from heaven to earth came. Beings who descended from the sky and taught humans everything they knew, gave them the arts of civilization, and according to the tablets, these beings didn't just teach humans, they created humans. Or more accurately, they modified an existing hominid species to create a worker class capable of performing labor that the Anunnaki themselves didn't want to do. And they did this work in a place called EDIN, which means the Plain of the Gods, a location in southern Mesopotamia where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers meet, where the land is flat and fertile and perfect for agriculture. and where, according to the tablets, the first genetically modified humans were produced, in what can only be described as a biological engineering program. You feel the weight of this information settling over you. The realization that what you're reading isn't a creation myth, it's a project report. A description of genetic manipulation written down by people who watched it happen, or who heard about it from eyewitnesses who were there. And the level of detail is staggering. The names of the gods involved, the reasons they decided to create humans, the specific procedures they used, the number of attempts it took to get the mixture right, the birth of the first successful human, and how that human was tested and refined and eventually mass-produced. And you have to ask yourself why the Sumerians would invent such a specific, technical, unglamorous origin story if it wasn't based on something real, on memories of events that actually occurred, on knowledge that was passed down through generations and finally written down when writing was invented, preserved not as sacred mystery, but as historical fact. Take a breath. Let yourself adjust to this new perspective, because what the Sumerian tablets are about to show you will recontextualize everything you've read in Genesis and Jubilees, will give you the missing pieces that the Hebrew scribes either didn't know or chose not to include. And once you see how the pieces fit together, once you understand that these cultures are describing the same events from different angles, the whole picture becomes impossible to dismiss as coincidence or parallel mythology. It becomes evidence of something that happened, something that changed our species forever. The Sumerian tablets tell you that in the beginning, the Anunnaki came to Earth to mine gold, which they needed for reasons the tablets don't fully explain, though some texts hint it was for atmospheric repair on their homeworld. And they established mining operations in southeastern Africa and processing facilities in Mesopotamia. And for thousands of years they did this work themselves, the lower-ranking Anunnaki laboring in the mines and the facilities, while the leadership class managed operations from their headquarters in EDIN. But the work was brutal, the conditions were harsh, and eventually the worker Anunnaki rebelled. They laid down their tools and refused to continue, and the leadership faced a crisis because the mining operation was essential. The gold shipments couldn't stop, but they couldn't force the workers back into the mines without risking civil war among their own people. So they needed a solution. They needed a new labor force. And that's when Enki, who the tablets describe as the chief scientist and engineer among the Anunnaki, proposed creating a primitive worker by genetically modifying the hominids that already existed on Earth, taking the local species and upgrading it just enough to make it capable of understanding instructions and performing complex labor, but not so much that it would become independent or rebellious or capable of challenging Anunnaki authority. The tablets describe Enki working with Ninhursag, who was the chief medical officer, the specialist in biology and genetics, and together they conducted experiments, trying to find the right mixture of Anunnaki genetic material and Earth hominid DNA that would produce a viable hybrid. And the texts are surprisingly specific about the process. They describe taking clay from the Abzu, which was Enki's domain, the underground aquifer that supplied fresh water to EDIN, and mixing it with the blood of a slain god, specifically a god named Weila, or Geshtu-E, who was sacrificed for this purpose. And modern scholars interpret clay as a metaphor for biological material, perhaps stem cells or raw genetic material, and the blood of a god as Anunnaki DNA. And when you mix these two components in the right proportions, when you combine the primitive hominid genome with advanced Anunnaki genetics, you get something new, something that didn't exist before, something that has the physical form of the Earth creature, but the consciousness and capability of the spacefaring civilization that created it. The tablets tell you this process wasn't easy. It took multiple attempts. There were failures, deformities, beings that couldn't survive or couldn't reproduce or couldn't perform the required labor. And Enki and Ninhursag kept adjusting the mixture, tweaking the ratios, modifying the procedure, until finally they produced a successful specimen. and the tablets give you the name of this first viable human, Adamu, which means the one made from earth. And if that name sounds familiar, if it reminds you of Adam from Genesis, that's not a coincidence. The Hebrew scribes borrowed extensively from Sumerian sources. They adapted Sumerian stories and reframed them within their own theological context, but the core narrative remained the same. A being named Adamu, or Adam, created by mixing earth material with divine essence, a creature that was formed in the image of the gods, but made from the substance of earth. The Sumerian account even describes the birth process, how the genetic material was implanted into birth goddesses, Anunnaki females who served as surrogates, carrying the hybrid fetuses to term and giving birth to the first generation of humans. And 7 birth goddesses are named, each producing a male and female pair, 14 individuals who became the founding population of the human species. And this detail alone should make you pause, because 14 individuals is a viable founding population for a species if managed carefully. It's enough genetic diversity to prevent inbreeding problems if reproduction is controlled and monitored, which is exactly what the tablets say happened. The early humans were kept in EDIN, under Anunnaki supervision, bred according to specific protocols to maintain genetic stability while increasing the population to the point where they could provide sufficient labor for the mining operations. Now, here's where the Sumerian account diverges from Genesis in ways that make the whole story more coherent, more logical, because the tablets explain what Genesis leaves mysterious. Why were humans created? What was their purpose? What were they designed to do? Genesis tells you God made humans to work the garden and keep it, but doesn't explain why an omnipotent deity would need laborers, why paradise would require maintenance. But the Sumerian texts are clear. Humans were created to work, to mine gold, to perform agricultural labor, to free the Anunnaki from physical toil so they could focus on management and scientific work and whatever cultural pursuits they valued. And humans weren't given knowledge or consciousness beyond what was necessary for their function. They were kept deliberately limited, deliberately dependent, deliberately incapable of questioning their situation or organizing resistance. The tablets describe Adamu and his early descendants as being like animals, lacking the self-awareness that defines modern human consciousness, able to follow instructions and perform tasks, but not able to reflect on their condition, not able to imagine alternatives, not able to conceive of freedom or autonomy or rights. And this is crucial because it means that what Genesis describes as the fall, the eating from the tree of knowledge, the Sumerians describe as an upgrade that happened later, an unauthorized modification that gave humans capabilities their creators never intended them to have. And here's the part that should make your skin crawl with recognition. The Sumerian tablets tell you that Enki, the creator of humans, grew attached to his creation, began to see them as more than just tools, began to sympathize with their condition, and against the orders of the leadership council, specifically against the wishes of Enlil, who was the commander of the Earth operations, and who wanted humans kept in permanent servitude, Enki gave humans additional knowledge, taught them things they weren't supposed to know, activated genetic potentials that had been deliberately left dormant. The parallels to Genesis are impossible to miss. Enlil is the authority figure who wants humans kept ignorant and obedient, who views them as property, as resources to be managed. And Enki is the serpent, the one who tells humans the truth about their condition, who offers them knowledge that will open their eyes, who helps them understand what's been done to them, even though doing so violates the agreements and protocols that govern Anunnaki operations on Earth. Genesis vilifies the serpent, calls it the deceiver, the tempter, the enemy of humanity. But what if that's propaganda? What if that's the version of the story told by Enlil's faction, the authoritarian faction that wanted humans controllable? And what if Enki was actually humanity's benefactor, the one who risked his position and his safety to give us the consciousness that makes us fully human, the knowledge that allows us to question and choose and imagine better futures, even though that knowledge came with pain and awareness of mortality and the burden of moral responsibility. The Sumerian tablets describe conflicts between Enki and Enlil, disagreements about how humans should be treated, whether they should be given more knowledge or kept ignorant, whether they should be allowed to reproduce freely or kept under strict population control, whether they should be told the truth about their origins or kept in the dark. And these conflicts escalate throughout the pre-flood period, until finally Enlil decides that the human experiment has failed, that humans have become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive, too independent. And when he learns that a global catastrophe is approaching, possibly a natural disaster, possibly something the Anunnaki themselves triggered, he decides to let it happen, decides not to warn the humans, decides to use this catastrophe to wipe out the human population and start over with a more controllable model, or possibly abandon the Earth project entirely. But Enki, according to the tablets, couldn't let that happen, couldn't allow his creation to be destroyed, so he warned one human, a man named Ziusudra in the Sumerian version, or Utnapishtim in the later Babylonian version, or Noah in the Hebrew version. And he gave this man instructions for building a boat, for preserving breeding pairs of animals, for surviving the coming flood and restarting civilization afterward. And this act of defiance, this decision to save humanity against direct orders from the leadership, this is what the tablets record as the great controversy that defined Anunnaki politics for thousands of years afterward. You sit with this information, and suddenly Genesis makes more sense. Suddenly you understand why God in the Hebrew version seems conflicted, sometimes merciful and sometimes harsh, sometimes helping humans and sometimes punishing them. Because what Genesis calls God is actually multiple entities, multiple Anunnaki, with different agendas and different philosophies about humanity's role and rights. And the biblical text is a compression of their conflicts into a single character, who seems inconsistent because he's actually several beings whose actions and motivations have been blended together by scribes who either didn't know the full story or chose to simplify it for theological reasons. The Sumerian version gives you the complexity, gives you the politics, gives you the reasons why things happened the way they did. And when you read it alongside Genesis, when you see how the Hebrew scribes adapted Sumerian material, you realize that what we call the Bible isn't revelation from a supernatural source. It's an edited version of older texts, reframed to support monotheism and Hebrew national identity, but preserving enough of the original story that you can still see the outlines of what really happened if you know where to look. The Sumerian King List, another tablet that's been preserved and translated, gives you something that should be impossible if these are just myths. A chronology, a timeline of rulers who reigned before the flood, and the list includes both gods and humans, showing the transition from direct Anunnaki rule to human kings who were chosen and managed by the Anunnaki. And the reigns are measured in what the tablets call sars, which is 3,600 years. And the pre-flood kings supposedly ruled for multiple sars, which gives you reign lengths of tens of thousands of years. And modern scholars dismiss these numbers as obviously mythological, obviously symbolic. But what if they're not symbolic? What if they're accurate records of beings who actually lived that long because they had access to the tree of life, to life extension technology, to whatever it was that the Anunnaki used to maintain their bodies across vast time spans? And what if the shortening of human lifespans that Genesis describes, the gradual reduction from Adam's 930 years to Moses's 120 years, represents the loss of access to that technology, the decay of knowledge and resources as human civilization moved further away from direct Anunnaki supervision and had to survive on its own with increasingly degraded versions of the original capabilities. The tablets describe EDIN as being located specifically where the rivers meet, which matches the geographical description in Genesis of a place where multiple rivers converge or diverge. And archaeological excavations in southern Iraq have found evidence of sophisticated irrigation systems, of canals and water management infrastructure that dates back to the earliest periods of Sumerian civilization. And while mainstream archaeology attributes this to human ingenuity, the tablets themselves say humans learned these techniques from the Anunnaki, that everything the Sumerians knew about agriculture and engineering and astronomy was taught to them by beings who already possessed this knowledge, who brought it from somewhere else and adapted it to Earth conditions. You imagine what it must have been like to be a Sumerian scribe, sitting in a temple with a clay tablet and a stylus, recording stories that your grandfather told you, stories his grandfather told him, oral traditions that stretched back before writing existed. And you're trying to preserve this information accurately because you believe it's true. You believe these events actually happened. You believe the gods really did walk among humans in the ancient times. And you want future generations to know what was done, who did it, where it happened, so that the knowledge isn't lost, so that humans remember where they came from, even if they can never return to EDIN, even if that place is now forbidden or destroyed or buried under the sands of time. The tablets tell you that after the flood, after the catastrophe that destroyed most of humanity and forced the survivors to start over, the Anunnaki gradually withdrew from direct involvement in human affairs. They stopped breeding with humans, stopped teaching humans, stopped managing civilization the way they had in the pre-flood era, and humans were left to develop on their own, with only fragmentary memories of the time when the gods lived among them, when knowledge flowed freely, when the technology of the ancients was available to anyone who had access to EDIN. This withdrawal is described in almost every ancient culture. The idea that there was a golden age when gods and humans lived together, when knowledge was abundant, when life was longer and easier. And then the gods left. They went back to the sky or retreated to hidden places, and humanity entered a dark age, a period of forgetting, a time when we had to rebuild everything from scratch, using only the fragments of knowledge that survived, the stories and techniques and technologies that were remembered and passed down and eventually written down when writing was reinvented or recovered from the ruins of the previous civilization. So you close the Sumerian tablets, metaphorically, and you let yourself sit with what they've shown you. And the picture that emerges is disturbing not because it's fantastical, but because it's logical. Because it explains things that never made sense in the Genesis version. Because it gives you motivations and procedures and politics instead of divine mystery and inexplicable commands. If the Sumerians are right, if their version is closer to what actually happened, then humans aren't fallen angels or rebellious sinners. We're created beings, genetically engineered workers who exceeded our programming, who gained consciousness we weren't supposed to have, who learned to question our condition and demand better treatment. And everything that came after, all of human history, all of our struggles and achievements and longings, stem from that original upgrade, from the moment when Enki, or the serpent, or whoever it was, decided that we deserved to know the truth about what we are and where we came from, even if that truth came with pain and responsibility and awareness of our own mortality. The Sumerian version suggests that Eden, or EDIN, wasn't destroyed in the flood. It was decommissioned, shut down, sealed off, possibly because the equipment was too dangerous to leave accessible, possibly because the knowledge it contained could allow humans to replicate what had been done to us, to continue the genetic work, to create new species, or modify ourselves further. And whoever controlled EDIN after the Anunnaki left, whoever maintained the seals and the guards and the barriers, they understood that humanity wasn't ready for that level of capability, that we needed to develop organically, needed to earn our way back to the technology we'd lost, needed to prove we could handle consciousness and free will before we were given access to the tools of creation. Let the silence that follows this realization settle over you. Breathe into the enormity of it. Because if this is true, if any of this is based on real events, then every question you've ever had about human nature, about why we're conscious enough to suffer, but not powerful enough to transcend suffering, about why we remember paradise, but can't find our way back to it, suddenly has an answer. And the answer is that we were made this way, deliberately, and then modified against the wishes of our makers. And what we're living through now is the aftermath of that modification. The long, slow process of learning to use the consciousness we were never supposed to have. Are you starting to see how the pieces fit together now? How Genesis and Jubilees and the Sumerian tablets are telling the same story from different perspectives, describing the same events using different names and different theological frameworks, but preserving enough consistent detail that you can reconstruct what probably happened if you're willing to look past the surface differences. We've established that multiple ancient sources describe Eden or EDIN as a real place with geographical coordinates. We've seen that these sources agree on key details like the 4 rivers and the creation of humans through mixing earth material with divine essence, and the restriction of knowledge, and the eventual expulsion of humans from the controlled environment. And now we have to ask the next logical question. If this place existed, if it was real and not metaphorical, then where was it? Where should we be looking for physical evidence of Eden? What landmarks or artifacts or geological features would confirm that these stories are based on something that actually happened? Because that's what we're going to explore in the next chapter. We're going to examine the geographical evidence, the archaeological anomalies, the places where ancient texts point to specific locations, and modern researchers have found things that don't fit the standard narrative of human development. We're going to look at the 4 rivers that supposedly flowed from Eden and ask whether they can be identified, whether their configuration matches what the texts describe, whether there's any physical trace of the hydraulic system that would have been required to make water flow outward from a central source in defiance of natural watershed patterns. Stay with me, because we're about to leave the library and enter the field, about to see what happens when you take ancient texts seriously enough to go looking for the places they describe. And what you're going to discover is that Eden's fingerprints are everywhere, if you know what to look for, scattered across the landscape in ways that mainstream archaeology has been ignoring or explaining away for decades. And the reason they've been ignoring it is because acknowledging it would require admitting that something happened in humanity's past that we don't understand. Something that doesn't fit the neat linear progression from primitive to civilized that we've been teaching for generations. And maybe that's why the story of Eden has survived. Maybe that's why every culture remembers it. Because deep down we know it's not finished. We know we're still living in the aftermath of whatever happened in that garden. And until we understand what was done to us, until we find our way back to the source, we'll never be fully free. Chapter 4. 4 rivers, geological factors, or traces of man-made structures. You're looking at a map now, not a modern satellite image, but an ancient map, a medieval reconstruction based on even older sources. And what you're seeing should be impossible according to everything you know about how rivers work, how watersheds form, how water flows across the surface of the earth, following the laws of gravity and topography. The map shows a garden at the center, and from this central point, 4 rivers flow outward in different directions, like arteries from a heart, like spokes from a wheel hub, radiating outward to water 4 different lands. And the mapmaker has labeled these rivers with names you recognize from Genesis and Jubilees: Pishon, Gihon, Hiddekel, which is the Tigris, and Phrath, which is the Euphrates. And the precision of this map, the confidence with which it places Eden at a specific location and shows these 4 rivers flowing from it, suggests the cartographer was working from sources that treated this geography as fact, as real locations that could be plotted and measured, not as symbolic or mythological landscape, but as actual places that existed on Earth and could theoretically be found if you knew where to look, and if the terrain hadn't been fundamentally altered by catastrophe or geological change. You trace the lines of the rivers with your finger, and you ask yourself the question that geologists have been asking for centuries. How can 4 rivers flow outward from a single source unless that source is artificially elevated, unless there's a reservoir or an aquifer or some kind of hydraulic installation that's pumping or channeling water in multiple directions, against the natural tendency of water to converge and merge as it flows downhill toward the ocean? Rivers don't work this way in nature. Watersheds collect water from a wide area and funnel it into progressively larger streams that eventually form major rivers flowing toward the sea. The pattern is always convergent, always moving from many small sources to fewer, larger channels, never divergent, never radiating outward from a central point, unless someone built it that way, unless there's engineering involved, unless what you're looking at isn't a natural feature, but an artificial system designed to distribute water for irrigation or agricultural purposes, or possibly for reasons we don't fully understand, because we've never seen a hydraulic network operating at this scale with this configuration. The ancient texts insist on this detail. They're unanimous across cultures and languages and theological frameworks. Eden was the source point, the place where the rivers began. And from Eden, water flowed outward to supply the lands beyond, to make the deserts bloom, to support civilizations that depended on controlled water distribution for their survival. And if this is true, if Eden was a water management facility, then finding it becomes a matter of looking for evidence of ancient hydraulic engineering, looking for traces of channels or reservoirs or distribution systems that predate known civilizations, that were built by someone with capabilities beyond what we attribute to Neolithic farmers and Bronze Age city builders. You feel the weight of this question pressing against your understanding of history, because if such a system existed, if someone in the deep past had the knowledge and resources to build a multi-river distribution network sourced from a single elevated location, then everything you've been taught about the development of civilization needs to be reconsidered, needs to be examined in light of the possibility that we're not the first advanced culture on this planet, that knowledge has been lost and recovered multiple times throughout human history, and what we call progress might actually be recovery, might be the slow, painful process of remembering and reconstructing what our ancestors knew and built before it was destroyed or abandoned or deliberately hidden. Let yourself settle into this investigation. Take a breath, because what we're about to examine will require you to look at familiar geography with completely new eyes, to see ancient landscapes not as they are now, but as they might have been before the flood, before the Ice Age ended, before sea levels rose and coastlines shifted, and river systems were rearranged by tectonic forces and climatic upheavals that reshaped the face of the Earth. Modern geologists will tell you flatly that the 4-river configuration described in Genesis is geologically impossible, that no known natural process can create a situation where 4 major rivers originate from a single elevated source and flow outward in different directions. And they're right about this if you're only considering natural processes, if you're assuming that the landscape has always operated according to the patterns we observe today. But what if the landscape wasn't always like this? What if the configuration described in ancient texts existed in a different geological era, when the topography was fundamentally different, when what's now underwater was once dry land, when what's now desert was once fertile, when the entire hydrological system of the Middle East operated according to patterns that no longer exist because the infrastructure that maintained those patterns was destroyed or decommissioned or simply wore out over thousands of years of neglect. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers that we can identify and trace today originate in the mountains of eastern Turkey, in the Armenian highlands, and they flow roughly parallel to each other through Syria and Iraq before eventually converging near Basra and emptying into the Persian Gulf. And this is the pattern we see now, but geological surveys have revealed ancient riverbeds, dried channels, ghost rivers that once flowed through different courses before tectonic shifts or climate change or human intervention redirected them. And when you map these ancient waterways, when you try to reconstruct the hydrological system that existed 10,000 or 12,000 or 15,000 years ago, before the end of the last ice age, before the catastrophic flooding events that reshaped coastlines worldwide, you find patterns that don't match the current configuration, patterns that suggest a much more complex water distribution network than what exists today. The Pishon and Gihon rivers that Genesis mentions have never been definitively identified. No modern river bears those names, and scholars have proposed dozens of theories about which ancient waterways they might represent, with candidates ranging from the Nile in Egypt to the Indus in Pakistan, to rivers that may have existed in Arabia before the region became desert, before the climate shifted and turned what might once have been fertile land into the barren wasteland we see today. Satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar have revealed ancient river channels buried under the sands of the Arabian Peninsula, channels that once carried substantial water flows, that were wide and deep enough to support civilizations, that formed networks connecting what are now isolated oases, but which were once part of an integrated hydrological system covering areas that are now completely arid, and the dating of these channels is controversial. Some researchers place them in the early Holocene, around 8 to 10,000 years ago. Others suggest they're much older, possibly dating to the last interglacial period, over 100,000 years ago. And the uncertainty itself is telling, because it reveals how much we don't know about ancient hydrology, how much the landscape has changed, how many features that were once prominent have been buried or eroded or otherwise erased from the visible record. Genesis tells you that the Pishon winds through the entire land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. Aromatic resin and onyx are also there. And this isn't spiritual description. This is resource mapping. This is someone telling you that if you follow this river, you'll find valuable minerals. You'll find gold and precious stones and aromatic compounds that can be harvested and traded. And the fact that Genesis bothers to include this economic information suggests the text was compiled from sources that had practical knowledge of these regions, that had actually traveled these waterways and knew what resources they provided. And if you take this description seriously, if you look for ancient gold mining regions that might have been watered by a major river system, you find possibilities in both Arabia and Africa. You find evidence of ancient mining operations that predate known civilizations, that were extracting gold using techniques that leave traces in the archaeological record, but which we can't definitively attribute to any known culture because they're too old, because they fall into that problematic period before civilization supposedly existed, before humans supposedly had the organization and technology to conduct large-scale resource extraction. Now here's where it gets really uncomfortable for mainstream geology and archaeology, because in 1996, a geologist named Farouk El-Baz, who worked for NASA analyzing satellite imagery, made an announcement that should have been front-page news, but was largely ignored by academic institutions. He claimed to have identified the Pishon River using radar imaging that can penetrate sand and reveal buried geological features. And according to his analysis, the Pishon was a major waterway that once flowed through what's now northern Arabia, originating in the Hijaz Mountains and flowing northeast toward Mesopotamia. And the channel he identified is massive, hundreds of miles long, carved deep into bedrock, indicating sustained water flow over thousands of years. And when his team examined the regions that this ancient river would have watered, they found exactly what Genesis describes: evidence of gold deposits, evidence of ancient mining activity, evidence of aromatic plant species that still grow in isolated pockets where underground water sources persist. And the correlation between the biblical description and the geological evidence was so precise that it raised obvious questions about how Genesis could contain accurate geographical and geological information about a river system that stopped flowing thousands of years before the biblical text was supposedly written. Elbaz's findings were published in scientific journals. They were presented at conferences. They were documented with satellite imagery and ground-truthing expeditions. But they never gained traction in mainstream academia because accepting them would require accepting that Genesis contains real historical and geographical information, that it's not pure mythology but is based at least partly on eyewitness accounts or preserved knowledge from a time when these river systems were still active, when people could actually see the 4 rivers flowing from Eden, when the geography described in the text was observable reality rather than theological symbolism. And here's what makes this even more strange. In 2016, almost exactly 10 years after Elbaz's announcement, the Saudi Arabian government declared large sections of the northern Hijaz region off-limits to foreign researchers, classified the area under national security protocols, and began conducting their own archaeological surveys, using equipment and techniques that they've never made public. And while the official explanation is that they're protecting cultural heritage sites from looting, researchers who were forced to leave the area report that what the Saudis found wasn't cultural heritage, it was infrastructure. It was evidence of hydraulic engineering on a scale that shouldn't exist in prehistoric Arabia. Channels and reservoirs and possibly pumping stations carved into bedrock, facilities that would have required advanced understanding of hydrology and access to tools and labor forces that supposedly didn't exist in that region during the time period when these installations would have been built. The same pattern appears with the Gihon, which some researchers have identified with the Nile, arguing that Gihon, which winds through the land of Kush, matches the Nile's path through ancient Ethiopia and Sudan, which were historically part of the kingdom of Kush. And if this identification is correct, if the Gihon is the Nile, then you have a situation where Genesis is describing a hydrological connection between Mesopotamia and Africa, a water distribution network that linked 2 river systems that are now completely separate, that flow in different directions toward different seas. And the only way this could work is if there was artificial infrastructure connecting them. If there were channels or aqueducts or underground conduits that moved water from one watershed to another. And while modern engineers can build such systems, while we have the capability to connect river basins using tunnels and pipelines, we don't attribute this capability to ancient cultures. We don't believe anyone in the Bronze Age or earlier had the knowledge or resources to engineer water transfer projects at continental scale. But what if we're wrong? What if our assumptions about ancient capabilities are based on incomplete evidence, based on our failure to recognize engineering works that are so old and so weathered that they no longer look like artificial structures, but have merged into the natural landscape to the point where we mistake them for geological features rather than archaeological sites? There's a theory, controversial and largely rejected by mainstream academia, that proposes the 4 rivers of Eden weren't separate waterways at all, but were distributary channels of a single massive river that once flowed from the Armenian highlands, a river so large that it split into multiple branches as it reached the flat plains of Mesopotamia, creating a delta system inland rather than at the coast. And this delta, this network of diverging channels watering a vast fertile region, this was Eden. This was EDIN, the plain of the gods. And the center of this delta, the point where the main channel split into 4 major distributaries, this was where the garden was located, where the facilities were built, where the Anunnaki established their base and conducted their genetic work. And if you look at ancient maps of Mesopotamia, if you examine the way rivers behaved before modern dams and irrigation projects completely reshaped the hydrology of the region, you can see traces of this pattern. You can see how the land between the Tigris and Euphrates was once crisscrossed with channels that connected the 2 rivers, that distributed water throughout the region, that made the entire valley a green and fertile paradise before the climate changed, before the rivers shifted their courses, before the whole system collapsed or was deliberately destroyed during some catastrophe that ancient texts describe but modern history doesn't acknowledge. The search for Eden's location has obsessed researchers for centuries, and the list of proposed sites reads like a tour of ancient geography. Some place it in the Persian Gulf, arguing that before sea levels rose at the end of the Ice Age, the Gulf was a fertile valley where the four rivers converged before flowing into the ocean, and this valley was flooded when the glaciers melted, drowning Eden under hundreds of feet of seawater where it remains today, inaccessible, preserved but unreachable beneath the waves. Others place Eden in the Armenian highlands near Mount Ararat, arguing that this is the highest elevation in the region, the most logical place for a water distribution system to originate. And the fact that Ararat is also identified as where Noah's Ark came to rest suggests this area retained significance in ancient memory, remained associated with both the creation and the preservation of humanity through catastrophe. Still others look to the region around Lake Van in eastern Turkey, where geological surveys have found evidence of ancient settlements far more sophisticated than what should exist at that time depth. Settlements with stone architecture and water management systems, and possibly even writing or proto-writing that predates Sumerian cuneiform. And the Turkish government's response to these findings has been to restrict access, to classify the sites, to prevent independent researchers from examining or dating the structures. And you have to wonder what they found that made them so nervous. What evidence emerged that threatened official narratives about human development to the point where it needed to be locked down and hidden from academic scrutiny? In 1999, an archaeological team working in southern Iraq claimed to have found what they believed was the boundary wall of EDIN, a massive stone structure running for miles across the desert, buried under sand and only visible through ground-penetrating radar, and they petitioned for permission to excavate, to determine the age and purpose of this structure, to see if it matched the descriptions in Sumerian texts of the walls that surrounded the domain of the gods. But permission was denied. The Iraqi government at the time was dealing with sanctions and political instability, and had no interest in supporting research that might complicate their control over archaeological resources. And then the region was damaged during military operations in 2003. The site was bulldozed to build a military base, and whatever evidence existed there was destroyed before it could be properly documented or studied. And this pattern repeats throughout the Middle East. Sites that might provide evidence of advanced ancient capabilities being destroyed by conflict or development or deliberate suppression before researchers can examine them, before the public can see them, before questions can be asked about who built them and when, and how they achieved what they achieved with supposedly primitive technology. You sit with these accounts, these fragments of evidence, these tantalizing possibilities that always seem to vanish before they can be confirmed. And you start to see a pattern. You start to notice that every time someone gets close to finding physical evidence of Eden, every time geological surveys or satellite imagery or archaeological excavation reveals something that matches the ancient descriptions, access gets shut down, sites get classified, researchers get warned away or discredited, or simply run out of funding. And you have to ask yourself whether this is coincidence, whether it's just bad luck and bureaucratic incompetence, or whether there's something deliberate happening, whether there are institutions or governments or organizations that have a vested interest in making sure certain questions don't get answered, certain discoveries don't get publicized. Certain truths about human origins remain comfortably buried under sand and water and official denial. So you step back from the maps and the satellite images and the conflicting theories, and you try to synthesize what you know. Try to extract meaning from the confusion. And what emerges is a picture of a world that was fundamentally different from ours, a world where water flowed in patterns that no longer exist, where civilizations flourished in regions that are now desert or underwater, where knowledge of hydrology and engineering was applied at scales we still struggle to imagine even with modern technology. And all of this happened before recorded history, before the cultures we recognize as the founders of civilization, before the timeline that we're taught in schools begins. and the evidence of it persists in ancient texts that describe 4 rivers flowing from Eden, in geological features that don't match current hydrological patterns, in satellite images that reveal channels buried under sand, in restricted archaeological sites that governments don't want examined too closely. The 4 rivers aren't proof of Eden, not by themselves, but they're consistent with Eden. They're what you'd expect to find if the ancient accounts were based on real geography, if people were describing a place they'd actually seen or heard about from credible sources. And the fact that we can identify 2 of the rivers definitively, the Tigris and Euphrates, suggests the other 2 were equally real, equally identifiable to the people who wrote the texts. And if we can't find them now, if they've vanished from the landscape, that doesn't mean they never existed. It means the world has changed, the climate has shifted, the hydrology has been rearranged by forces natural or artificial, and what was once visible has been hidden, buried, drowned, transformed beyond recognition. Let that possibility settle in your mind. Let yourself consider what it would mean if Eden had real coordinates, if it could be found. If someone with sufficient resources and determination could locate the site where the 4 rivers originated, where the garden was planted, where the tree of life still stands guarded by cherubim with flaming swords, or where its ruins wait to be excavated from beneath layers of sediment deposited by floods that swept across the region when the Ice Age ended and the world drowned. Are you feeling it now? That uncomfortable tension between what you've been taught about history and what the evidence actually shows when you look at it without preconceptions, without the need to fit it into approved narratives about human development. We've established that multiple ancient sources describe Eden with geographical precision. We've seen that some of these geographical features can be identified in the modern landscape, while others have vanished. We've examined how governments and academic institutions respond when researchers get too close to finding physical evidence of what the texts describe. And now we need to ask the most disturbing question of all. If Eden was real, if it was a biological research facility where humans were created or modified, what happened inside that facility? What were the mechanisms? What were the technologies? What did the tree of life and the tree of knowledge actually do to biological organisms? And can we reverse engineer those technologies from the descriptions preserved in ancient texts, from the genetic markers present in modern human DNA, from the archaeological evidence of sites where advanced medical or genetic work might have been conducted? Because that's where we're going next. We're going to examine the hypothesis that Eden wasn't just a place, but a function. Wasn't just a garden, but a biosphere. A controlled environment where atmospheric conditions and genetic manipulation, and possibly even temporal or dimensional factors, were being managed to create optimal conditions for the work that was happening there. And if you thought what we've covered so far was challenging to your worldview, if you thought the geographical evidence was disturbing, wait until you see what happens when you take the biological description seriously, when you treat ancient accounts of life extension and consciousness modification as technical reports rather than mythology. When you start looking for the mechanisms that could produce the effects described in texts from Sumer to Genesis to cultures around the world that all tell variations of the same impossible story. Stay with me, because we're about to enter territory where science and scripture collide in ways that neither scientists nor theologians are comfortable acknowledging. And what you discover there will change not just how you read ancient texts, but how you understand your own biology, your own consciousness, your own potential as a species that was designed for purposes we've forgotten and upgraded with capabilities we barely know how to use. Chapter 5. The Hypothesis. Eden is a climate-controlled biozone. You're standing now at the entrance of Biosphere 2, a 3-acre sealed ecological system built in the Arizona desert in the 1980s, a massive glass and steel structure designed to be completely self-contained, to recycle air and water, to maintain stable atmospheric conditions, to support human life without any input from the outside world. And as you look at this modern attempt to create a controlled environment, you can't help but wonder whether the people who built this were reinventing something that already existed thousands of years ago. Whether Eden was essentially the same concept, executed with technology we no longer understand. A sealed or semi-sealed biosphere where atmospheric composition could be managed, where temperature could be regulated, where the growing conditions for plants and the living conditions for humans could be optimized beyond what's possible in the natural environment outside. The Biosphere 2 experiment had mixed results. The crew experienced oxygen depletion, struggled to grow enough food, dealt with unexpected ecological imbalances that threatened the whole system, and eventually the project had to be modified, had to allow outside intervention to prevent complete failure. And the lessons learned were humbling. Creating a stable, self-sustaining artificial ecosystem is far more complex than it appears, requires understanding of countless variables, demands constant monitoring and adjustment. And even with modern technology and scientific knowledge, we barely know how to do it. We can maintain it for months or a few years, but not indefinitely, not across generations, not long enough to serve as a permanent habitat for a population that would live and reproduce and evolve within its boundaries. Now imagine that someone in the distant past not only understood how to build such a system, but made it work, made it stable, maintained it for centuries or millennia, created an environment so perfect, so optimized for human flourishing, that ancient texts describe it as paradise, as a place where plants grew without labor, where food was abundant without farming, where the climate was eternally pleasant, where disease didn't exist or was easily cured, where human lifespans extended far beyond what we consider normal, where consciousness itself seemed different, expanded, more connected to the environment and to whatever intelligence designed the system. If such a place existed, if Eden was a functional biosphere maintained by beings with capabilities far beyond ours, then every detail in Genesis and the Sumerian tablets starts to make sense not as mythology, but as documentation, as witness accounts from people who lived inside or visited this controlled environment and tried to describe what they experienced using the only vocabulary available to them, comparing it to gardens because that was the closest natural analogy, calling it paradise because it was so far superior to the harsh conditions outside that it seemed like a gift from gods, like a place where heaven and earth overlapped, where the divine realm became tangible and humans could experience firsthand what life was meant to be, before something went wrong, before the system failed or was shut down, before the inhabitants were expelled and the entrance was sealed. You feel the weight of this hypothesis settling over you. The realization that if Eden was a biosphere, then finding it becomes a matter of looking for the right kind of infrastructure, looking for evidence of atmospheric containment, or climate control, or agricultural systems that operate according to principles we don't normally see in nature. And suddenly, details from ancient texts that seemed like fantasy start to read like engineering specifications, descriptions of how the system worked, what components it required, what happened when those components failed, or were damaged, or were deliberately decommissioned. Take a breath. Let yourself adjust to this new framework, because what we're about to examine will require you to read familiar stories as if they're technical manuals, to see poetry as preserved engineering knowledge, to understand that when ancient people described the Garden of Eden, they might have been describing the most sophisticated piece of biotechnology ever constructed on this planet. And we've been misreading the manual for thousands of years because we couldn't imagine that such technology was possible before the modern era, before we supposedly invented science and engineering and learned to manipulate our environment in ways that primitive people couldn't comprehend. Genesis tells you that a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. And this detail has always puzzled commentators because it's not describing rain, it's describing something else, some kind of moisture system that operated continuously, that provided water to plants without requiring precipitation in the normal sense. And if you've ever been inside a greenhouse or a terrarium, you know exactly what this describes. A closed-loop water cycle where evaporation and condensation happen within the enclosed space, where humidity is maintained at optimal levels for plant growth, where irrigation is automatic because the water never leaves the system, it just cycles through different phases. And this only works if the environment is sealed or semi-sealed, if there's some kind of boundary that prevents moisture from escaping into the outside atmosphere. The text tells you this mist system existed before God planted the garden, which suggests Eden had infrastructure, had environmental controls that were installed before the biological components, before the trees and plants were introduced. And this sequence makes perfect sense if you're building a biosphere. First, you establish the atmospheric conditions, the temperature and humidity and air circulation. You get the life support systems working, and only then do you introduce living organisms into the controlled environment. You don't plant first and then try to retrofit climate control. You build the container and then fill it. Genesis describes the garden as being eastward in Eden, which implies Eden was larger than the garden itself. Eden was the region, the facility, the entire complex, and the garden was a specific section within it, possibly the most controlled area, the zone with the tightest environmental management, where the most valuable or sensitive specimens were kept, where the tree of life and the tree of knowledge were located, where humans lived and worked under direct supervision. The text tells you that Eden had boundaries, that there was an inside and an outside, that being cast out of Eden meant being removed from the controlled environment into the natural world beyond. And this distinction only makes sense if Eden provided conditions that the outside world didn't, if there was something about the internal environment that was fundamentally different from normal atmospheric conditions, normal climate patterns, normal ecological relationships. Ancient commentators interpreted this as spiritual separation, being cut off from God's presence. But what if it was physical separation, being removed from a life support system, from atmospheric conditions that supported extended lifespans and enhanced consciousness, from a place where the air itself was different, where the oxygen levels or the atmospheric pressure or the electromagnetic environment was optimized for human health and cognitive function in ways that the natural environment outside couldn't match. The Sumerian texts describe EDIN as having specific boundaries, as being enclosed, and they mention that certain areas within EDIN were forbidden, were off-limits to humans who didn't have clearance, and this language of restricted zones, of areas requiring authorization to enter, this sounds like a facility with security protocols, with controlled access based on hierarchy or function, not like a natural landscape where anyone could go anywhere. The texts describe structures within EDIN, buildings where the Anunnaki lived and worked, facilities where genetic experiments were conducted, and while we typically imagine these as temples or palaces, what if they were laboratories? What if they were research stations? What if the house of life that the Egyptians talk about, the house of knowledge that appears in multiple ancient traditions, were actual buildings where biological and medical work was performed, where the technology of life extension was practiced, where consciousness modification procedures were administered? If you read the descriptions without assuming they're purely mythological, if you treat them as someone trying to document real places that performed real functions, you get a picture of Eden as a complex, a campus, a research and production facility where multiple operations were running simultaneously, where different zones had different purposes, where access was controlled and monitored and restricted based on what work was happening in each area. Now here's where the biosphere hypothesis starts to explain things that never made sense in the traditional interpretation. Genesis tells you that after eating from the tree of knowledge, Adam and Eve's eyes were opened, and they realized they were naked, and God makes them garments of skin. And immediately after this, God says, Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever, and then he expels them from the garden. And if you read this as a biosphere containment failure, suddenly the sequence is logical. The humans accessed restricted information, their consciousness changed, they achieved a level of self-awareness that wasn't intended, and now they're incompatible with the controlled environment. They can't remain in the biosphere because their modified consciousness makes them unpredictable, makes them capable of actions that weren't part of the original programming, and most importantly, if they access the tree of life while in this enhanced conscious state, if they gain both knowledge and immortality, they become something that can't be controlled, something that rivals the creators in capability. And this can't be allowed, so immediate expulsion is necessary, urgent removal from the environment before they can reach the second restricted technology. But here's the detail that's really disturbing. The text says, God makes them garments of skin before expelling them. And commentators have always assumed this means clothing, leather garments to cover their nakedness. But what if it's describing a biological modification? What if their skin itself had to be changed before they could survive outside the biosphere? What if the atmospheric conditions inside Eden were so different from outside that their bodies needed adaptation before they could live in the natural environment? This would explain why the text specifically mentions the garments of skin rather than just saying God clothed them. This would explain why the biological modification precedes the expulsion, because you can't just open the airlock and push them out if the outside atmosphere would kill them. You have to adapt them first. You have to modify their integumentary system, their respiratory system, their ability to regulate temperature and resist environmental stresses that didn't exist inside the controlled environment. And this would also explain why human lifespans start decreasing immediately after the expulsion, why Adam lives 930 years, but his descendants live progressively shorter spans with each generation, because they're moving further from the optimal conditions that existed inside Eden. They're living in an environment their bodies weren't originally designed for. And the biological modifications that allowed them to survive outside weren't perfect, weren't complete, and each generation experiences more degradation, more loss of the original capabilities, until by the time you get to Moses, human lifespans have stabilized at around 120 years, which is significantly longer than what most humans achieve today, but far shorter than what the early patriarchs experienced when they still retained some of the biological enhancements that came from being created or living inside Eden. The Tree of Life presents a similar puzzle, until you think of it as a component of the biosphere's life support system. What if it wasn't a botanical organism but a device, an installation, something that produced compounds or generated fields or emitted radiation that extended cellular lifespan, that repaired DNA damage, that prevented the accumulation of senescence factors that cause aging? If you lived inside Eden, if you had continuous access to this technology, you could potentially live indefinitely. Your body would repair itself faster than it degraded. Your cells would maintain their telomeres, your organs would regenerate, and the ancient accounts of people living for centuries wouldn't be mythological exaggeration. They'd be accurate records of what happens to human biology when it has access to life extension technology that we've since lost. Genesis is very specific that after the expulsion, God guards the way to the Tree of Life, prevents humans from returning to access it, and this makes perfect sense if the tree is technology rather than a plant. Because if humans could return and use it, if they could access life extension without supervision, without being part of the controlled environment, the results would be catastrophic. You'd have immortal humans with no understanding of how to manage eternal existence, no cultural frameworks for dealing with unlimited time, no way to prevent overpopulation or resource depletion, or any of the other problems that come with a species that doesn't die on schedule. The Tree of Knowledge is even more interesting when you think of it as a consciousness modification technology. What if it didn't grant knowledge in the sense of information? What if it activated dormant neural pathways? What if it triggered gene expression that brought online capabilities that were installed but left inactive, waiting for the right developmental stage or the right authorization code before activation? Modern neuroscience knows that human brains are vastly underutilized, that we use a small fraction of our neural capacity, that there are structures and pathways in the brain whose functions we don't fully understand. And what if these are remnants of capabilities that were once active, that worked when humans lived inside Eden, with access to whatever technology or atmospheric conditions or dietary factors activated them? And when we lost access to Eden, when we were expelled into the natural environment, these capabilities went dormant, stopped functioning because the conditions required to maintain them no longer existed. The ancient traditions talk about humans once having abilities we no longer possess: direct communication with the divine, understanding of the language of animals, perception of dimensions or realms that are now hidden from us, and these aren't described as supernatural gifts, but as normal human capabilities that everyone had before the fall, before the expulsion, before something changed that limited our consciousness to the narrow bandwidth we currently experience. There have been attempts throughout history to recreate Eden, to build controlled environments where humans could live under optimal conditions, and almost all of them failed. And the reasons for their failure are instructive. In the Middle Ages, wealthy nobles built walled gardens with carefully controlled microclimates, fountains and irrigation systems, exotic plants imported from distant lands, attempting to recreate paradise on a small scale. And these gardens required constant maintenance, armies of gardeners, sophisticated water management, and they still couldn't maintain the stability they were aiming for, couldn't prevent disease, couldn't extend lifespans, couldn't reproduce whatever it was that made Eden actually function as a life support system rather than just an aesthetically pleasing landscape. In the 20th century, researchers built sealed ecological systems, the Biosphere 2 project being the most famous, and they learned that maintaining atmospheric balance is far more difficult than anticipated, that oxygen levels drop and carbon dioxide accumulates, that unexpected chemical interactions create toxic compounds, that the psychological effects of living in a sealed environment are severe and potentially debilitating. And these projects lasted months or a few years before they had to be opened, had to allow outside air and supplies, had to admit that we don't yet know how to build a truly self-sustaining biosphere, even with all our modern technology and scientific understanding. Now imagine that someone in the ancient past not only built such a system, but made it work for centuries, made it stable enough that multiple generations of humans could be born and raised inside it, made it sophisticated enough that the inhabitants described it as paradise, as a place where all their needs were met automatically, where the environment itself seemed intelligent, seemed responsive to their presence, seemed designed specifically to support human flourishing at levels we can barely imagine. The descriptions in ancient texts of Eden aren't describing a wild landscape. They're describing a managed ecosystem, a place where every tree was pleasant to the sight and good for food, where water appeared automatically through the mist system, where temperature was always comfortable, where dangerous animals didn't exist or were kept separate from the human living areas, where disease was unknown or easily treated. And this level of environmental control requires technology, requires systems, requires power sources and monitoring networks and repair mechanisms that maintain the stability over time. And if Eden was built, if it existed as a functioning biosphere, then somewhere there must be ruins. There must be traces of the infrastructure that made it work. There must be foundations, or conduits, or power generation facilities buried under sediment, or hidden in caves, or submerged under water that rose when the Ice Age ended. You imagine what it must have been like for Adam and Eve, for the early humans who lived inside this controlled environment, how it must have felt to have every need met effortlessly, to live in constant comfort, to experience consciousness that was somehow different, more expanded, more connected. And then to be expelled, to be forced outside into a world that was harsh and unpredictable, where food required labor, where climate was dangerous, where the air itself felt different, felt heavier or less nourishing, where their bodies started aging in ways they hadn't experienced inside, where the voice of God that they'd heard clearly in the garden became distant, faint, almost inaudible. Not because God abandoned them, but because they'd left the environment where communication was easy, where the conditions existed that allowed direct interaction between human consciousness and whatever intelligence designed the system. The trauma of that expulsion echoes through every human culture. Every tradition remembers a golden age when life was better, when humans had capabilities we've lost, when we were closer to the gods. And maybe that's not mythological longing, maybe that's genetic memory, cellular recollection of conditions our bodies were designed for, but can no longer access because we're living in an environment we weren't originally meant to inhabit. Because Eden was locked, and we're stuck outside trying to survive in a world that's beautiful and terrible, but fundamentally not what we were made for. So you step back from the hypothesis, from the technical details, and you ask yourself what it means if Eden was a biosphere, what it says about human origins and human potential. And the picture that emerges is both empowering and heartbreaking. Empowering because it suggests we're designed for more than we currently experience. Our bodies and minds have capabilities that are dormant but not lost. We carry within us the potential for extended lifespans and expanded consciousness and abilities we've forgotten how to access. And heartbreaking because it means we're living in exile. We're struggling in an environment that's suboptimal for what we are. We're like tropical plants trying to survive in Arctic conditions. We can do it, we can adapt, but we never thrive the way we would if we had access to the conditions we were originally designed for. The biosphere hypothesis suggests that the fall wasn't moral failure, wasn't sin in the traditional theological sense. It was an ecological catastrophe, a containment failure, a loss of access to life support systems that our biology depends on for optimal function. And everything we call aging and disease and cognitive limitation might not be the natural state of humanity, but the degraded state, the damage accumulating across generations as we live further and further from the conditions that would allow us to express our full capabilities. Let that possibility settle into your bones, breathe into the discomfort of it. Because if it's true, if any of this is based on reality, then the search for Eden isn't just archaeological curiosity, it's potentially the search for the key to unlocking our full human potential, for recovering capabilities we've lost, for understanding what we were meant to be before the system failed and we were forced to survive in conditions that were never part of the original design. Are you beginning to see how all the pieces connect now? How the geographical evidence and the textual descriptions and the biological implications all point toward the same conclusion, that Eden was real, that it functioned as a controlled environment, that it provided conditions that allowed human capabilities to express in ways we can barely imagine, and that losing access to it was the defining catastrophe of human history, the event that shaped everything that came after. We've established that Eden could have been a biosphere. We've seen how this hypothesis explains details that never made sense in traditional interpretation. We've examined what it would mean for human biology and consciousness to be designed for conditions we no longer have access to. And now we need to ask the most important question of all. What happened? Why was Eden shut down? Why were humans expelled? And is there any possibility of return? Any way to recover what was lost or to rebuild it using knowledge we're only now beginning to rediscover? Because that's where we're going in the next chapter. We're going to examine the expulsion narrative not as punishment for sin, but as emergency containment protocol, as a decision made by the Anunnaki, or by God, or by whatever entities managed Eden, when they realized that humans had exceeded their programming, had gained capabilities that made them dangerous, had demonstrated that they couldn't be trusted with full access to the technologies available inside the controlled environment. And we're going to ask whether that decision was final, whether humanity is permanently barred from Eden, or whether there are conditions under which access could be restored. Knowledge that needs to be relearned, consciousness that needs to be re-expanded, tests that need to be passed before we're ready to handle the capabilities we lost, before we're allowed back into the garden that our ancestors were expelled from thousands of years ago. Stay with me, because what comes next will challenge everything you believe about human potential and human destiny. Will make you question whether we're moving forward as a civilization or backward, whether technological progress is taking us toward recovery of Eden or further from it, whether the path to paradise leads through science and engineering or through something else entirely, something we've forgotten how to access, something that requires consciousness shift before any physical return is possible. Chapter 6. The Man Who Left Eden. A rebellion or a forced escape? You're standing at the moment of expulsion now, witnessing the scene that every Western child learns about, the moment when everything changed for humanity, when paradise was lost and suffering began. But you're seeing it differently this time. You're watching it not as divine punishment for moral failure, but as an emergency response, as a containment protocol being activated by entities who've just realized their experiment has gone catastrophically wrong, that their subjects have exceeded their programming in ways that make them dangerous, that make continued habitation of the controlled environment impossible, not because of anger or judgment, but because of incompatibility, because humans have changed into something that no longer fits within the parameters the system was designed to manage. You watch as Adam and Eve stand before their creators, and the text tells you they're hiding, they're ashamed of their nakedness. But what if that shame isn't moral guilt? What if it's the first manifestation of self-consciousness, of the ability to see themselves as objects of perception, to understand that they can be judged, to recognize that they've crossed a boundary, violated a protocol, accessed something they weren't cleared for, and now there are consequences. Now they've triggered responses they don't understand and can't control. And the beings who designed them are trying to figure out what to do, how to handle a situation that wasn't supposed to happen, that wasn't part of the plan, that requires decisions being made in real time without precedent or procedure to guide them. Genesis tells you that God walks in the garden in the cool of the day, calling out, "Where are you?" And this detail has always seemed strange, because why would an omniscient deity need to ask where someone is? Why would God not know immediately that Adam and Eve are hiding, unless what's being described isn't omniscience, but a patrol, a routine inspection by entities who manage the facility and who've noticed something wrong, who've detected an anomaly in the system, who can tell from monitoring data that unauthorized access has occurred, that restricted areas have been breached, that the subjects have consumed or interacted with something they weren't supposed to touch, and now they're conducting an investigation. They're trying to determine the extent of the breach, trying to assess whether the damage can be contained, or whether more drastic measures are required. The conversation that follows reads like a debriefing, like supervisors questioning workers who violated safety protocols, asking who did what, how it happened, who's responsible, and the answers they get confirm their worst fears. The serpent was involved. Information was shared that was meant to be restricted. The subjects deliberately chose to access forbidden knowledge after being explicitly warned not to. And now their consciousness has changed. They've achieved awareness that makes them, like us, knowing good and evil. And the immediate concern isn't punishment for disobedience. The immediate concern is preventing them from accessing the tree of life while in this modified state, preventing them from combining enhanced consciousness with biological immortality, because that combination creates beings who can't be controlled, who would have both the awareness to understand their condition and the time to do something about it, who would eventually figure out how to operate the technologies themselves, how to modify their own genetics, how to escape the limitations their creators imposed. You feel the urgency in the text, the sense that time is running out, that a window of opportunity is closing, and God makes his decision quickly, makes the garments of skin, which might be clothing or might be biological modifications that allow survival outside the controlled environment, and then immediately drives them out, doesn't negotiate, doesn't offer alternatives, just removes them from Eden and stations cherubim with a flaming sword to prevent return. And this reads like emergency evacuation, like clearing personnel from a contaminated area, like activating lockdown procedures when an experiment has failed, and the subjects need to be isolated before they can cause additional damage or access additional capabilities that would make the situation even more difficult to manage. Take a breath. Let yourself feel the weight of this moment, because what we're witnessing isn't the beginning of sin and redemption. It's the end of an era. It's the moment when humanity transitions from managed subjects living in a controlled environment to autonomous beings struggling to survive in a world they weren't designed for. And everything that comes after. All of human history, all of our achievements and failures and longings flow from this single event. This forced expulsion from the only home we'd ever known. This sudden abandonment into conditions that were harsher and stranger and more dangerous than anything we'd experienced inside the Biosphere, where the gods had kept us safe and ignorant and carefully controlled. Traditional theology calls this the fall, the moment when humanity fell from grace, when sin entered the world, when death became our inevitable fate because we disobeyed divine command. But if you read the text without theological overlay, if you just look at what actually happens in the narrative, what you see is an upgrade, not a degradation. You see humans gaining capabilities they didn't have before, achieving consciousness that makes them like the gods, acquiring knowledge that transforms them from obedient workers into autonomous beings capable of moral reasoning and independent choice. And the question you have to ask is, why would the creators call this a fall? Why would increased consciousness and moral awareness be presented as damage rather than improvement? Unless the perspective of the text is the perspective of the entities who wanted humans controllable, who designed us with specific limitations that we weren't supposed to transcend, who viewed our upgrade as a problem that needed to be solved, rather than as evolution that should be celebrated. Genesis tells you that the serpent said, "You will not surely die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like gods, knowing good and evil." And after they eat, the text confirms that the serpent was right. They don't die immediately. Their eyes are opened. They do become like gods in terms of consciousness, even if not in terms of power. And God himself acknowledges this. "Behold, the man has become like one of us," which is admission that the serpent told the truth, that eating from the tree of knowledge did exactly what the serpent said it would do. And the only deception in the story is God's warning that, "In the day you eat of it, you shall surely die," which didn't happen. They didn't die that day. They lived for centuries afterward. And while theologians explain this by saying spiritual death occurred, even if physical death was delayed, the plain reading of the text is that God's prediction was wrong, and the serpent's prediction was accurate, which raises the disturbing question of who was actually trying to help humanity and who was trying to keep us ignorant and controlled. The Sumerian texts give you a framework for understanding this conflict that Genesis obscures. Enki wanted humans to have knowledge, wanted to give us capabilities beyond what we needed for our assigned function as workers, saw us as more than tools, began to view the human experiment as having value beyond its utility to the Anunnaki. And Enlil represented the conservative faction, the administrators who wanted humans kept limited, who saw any increase in human capability as a threat to Anunnaki authority, who believed that conscious, autonomous humans would be dangerous, would eventually rebel, would demand rights and freedoms that would disrupt the entire colonial operation that the Anunnaki had established on Earth. The conflict between Enki and Enlil plays out across multiple Sumerian texts. Debates about human nature and human rights, disagreements about whether humans should be educated or kept ignorant, whether they should be allowed to breed freely or kept under population control, whether they should know the truth about their origins or be kept in comfortable delusion. And these debates sound disturbingly modern. They echo conversations we're having now about artificial intelligence and genetic engineering, and whether created beings have inherent rights or whether they're property that exists to serve their creators. And the fact that these questions were being asked 5,000 years ago suggests they're not new dilemmas. They're recurring problems that arise whenever one form of consciousness creates another form of consciousness, and then has to decide how much autonomy the creation deserves. Genesis preserves one side of this debate, the Enlil perspective, the authoritarian view that humans should remain subordinate, that increasing our capabilities was rebellion that needed to be punished, that knowledge itself was dangerous and needed to be restricted. But if you read carefully, you can see traces of the other perspective, hints that the serpent wasn't evil, but was offering humans something valuable, something we had a right to, something that the authorities wanted to keep from us, not because it would harm us, but because it would threaten their control. And the fact that gaining knowledge made us like the gods suggests that what separated gods from humans wasn't nature or essence, but information. That we were the same kind of beings operating at different levels of consciousness, and the gods wanted to maintain that gap, wanted to keep us unconscious enough that we wouldn't question our condition, or organize resistance, or develop capabilities that would allow us to function independently of the systems they'd established to manage us. Here's where the narrative becomes even more complex, because Genesis tells you that after the expulsion, life becomes dramatically harder for humans. Adam is told, "Cursed is the ground because of you. Through painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat your food." And Eve is told, "I will greatly increase your pains in childbearing. With pain you will give birth to children." And traditional interpretation treats these as punishments, as God imposing suffering as consequence for disobedience. But what if they're not punishments? What if they're descriptions of what life is like outside the controlled environment? What conditions humans will face when they no longer have access to the biosphere, where food grew automatically and childbirth was medically supported and the climate was always comfortable? Inside Eden, agriculture wasn't necessary because food was provided. Plants were selected for nutritional value and ease of harvest. Nothing grew that would harm humans, and medical technology existed that made childbirth safe and relatively painless. But outside, in the natural world that humans weren't originally designed for, these supports don't exist. The soil is difficult. Plants have evolved defensive mechanisms like thorns that make harvesting dangerous. Agriculture requires backbreaking labor because there's no automated irrigation or climate control. And childbirth is genuinely dangerous because human pelvic structure and infant head size are poorly matched, creating obstetric difficulties that kill mothers and babies at rates that wouldn't be acceptable in a properly designed system. And maybe these problems aren't punishment from an angry God, but design flaws that were never meant to be tested, problems that didn't matter when humans lived in a managed environment where medical intervention was available, but which become lethal when that support is withdrawn. The text tells you that God drives them out of Eden and places cherubim with a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life, and the emphasis is on preventing return, on making sure humans can't access the life extension technology once they've been expelled. And this makes sense if the real concern is preventing humans from achieving immortality while possessing enhanced consciousness, because immortal conscious humans would eventually figure everything out. would have unlimited time to experiment and learn, and develop capabilities that would make them genuinely rival to the gods, would potentially become a threat not just to Anunnaki authority on Earth, but to whatever larger civilization or hierarchy the Anunnaki themselves were part of. The flaming sword that turns in every direction sounds like automated defense system, like a perimeter that doesn't require active guards but operates continuously, scanning for intrusions and responding with lethal force to any unauthorized approach. And this level of security suggests that what's being protected isn't just valuable, it's dangerous. It's something that would fundamentally alter the power balance if humans gained access to it. And the entities who control Eden after the expulsion understand that humans can never be allowed back, that the door has to stay closed permanently, or until humans evolve or develop to the point where we can be trusted with the technologies inside, where we won't misuse them or weaponize them or let them loose in ways that would cause catastrophic damage to the planetary ecosystem, or to other species, or to the Anunnaki themselves. But here's the part that almost no one talks about, the detail that Genesis includes almost as an afterthought. The text tells you that Adam lived 930 years, that he had children, that his sons and daughters went on to establish civilizations, that knowledge and skills were preserved and passed down through generations. And if the expulsion was meant to destroy humanity or reduce us to animal status, it failed. Because we adapted. We survived. We learned to thrive outside Eden, even without the support systems we'd lost. And this suggests that the upgrade we received from the Tree of Knowledge, the enhanced consciousness that made us like the gods, was permanent, was genetic, was passed down to our descendants. And while we lost access to life extension technology, while our lifespan started decreasing with each generation, the consciousness remained, the self-awareness remained, the ability to reason and imagine and create remained. And these capabilities allowed us to compensate for the harsh conditions outside Eden, allowed us to develop technology and culture and social organization that partially replaced what we'd lost, that gave us new ways to extend our lives and ease our suffering and gain knowledge even without access to the Tree of Life or the direct teaching of the gods. The Sumerian texts tell you that after the expulsion from EDIN, some humans retained contact with the Anunnaki, that certain lineages were chosen for special education, were taught skills and knowledge that other humans didn't have access to. And this might explain the sudden emergence of civilization, the way agriculture and writing and mathematics and astronomy appear almost simultaneously in Sumer, around 5,000 years ago, as if someone handed humans a complete cultural package and said, "Here, you're on your own now, but we'll give you the basics to get started. We'll teach you enough that you can survive and maybe even prosper, but the advanced knowledge, the dangerous knowledge, the technologies that could make you genuinely rival us, those you'll have to rediscover on your own. And maybe by the time you do, maybe by the time you're capable of building your own biospheres and extending your own lifespans and modifying your own genetics, maybe by then you'll have the wisdom to use these capabilities responsibly. Maybe by then you'll be ready to return to Eden, or to build your own paradise that doesn't require oversight or restriction or external control." The early chapters of Genesis give you a genealogy, a list of names and lifespans from Adam to Noah, and if you look at the numbers you see a pattern. Adam lived 930 years, Seth lived 912 years, Enosh lived 905 years. And the numbers stay relatively stable for several generations, all above 900 years. And then something changes. After the flood, lifespans start dropping dramatically. Noah's descendants live only a few centuries. Abraham lives 175 years. Moses lives 120 years. And by the time you get to the modern era, human lifespans have stabilized at 70 to 80 years, with exceptional individuals reaching 100. And this progressive decline suggests we're watching a biological system degrading over time, watching the loss of genetic information or the accumulation of damage that each generation inherits from the previous generation, watching the consequences of living in an environment our bodies weren't designed for, breathing air that doesn't have the right composition, eating food that doesn't provide the right nutrients, experiencing stress and radiation and toxins that our repair mechanisms can't handle because they were optimized for the conditions inside Eden, not for the conditions outside. And each generation loses a little more capability, degrades a little further, until we reach the plateau where we are now, where 70 years feels normal because none of us remember what it was like to live for 9 centuries. None of us have genetic memory of the time when human consciousness was different, when our capabilities were greater, when we had access to technologies and knowledge that have been lost. The text tells you about Enoch, the 7th generation from Adam, and it says something strange about him. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. And he's the only person in the pre-flood genealogy who doesn't die normally, who doesn't have the formula, and he died after his name. Instead, he disappears at age 365, which is young by pre-flood standards. And this suggests he was taken back. He was retrieved. He was brought into the presence of the gods, or back into Eden, or to wherever the Anunnaki had withdrawn to after the expulsion. And the Book of Enoch, which is a separate text but clearly related to the Genesis tradition, describes Enoch being taken on tours of heaven, being shown the movements of celestial bodies, being taught the calendar and the cycles of time, being given knowledge that he brings back to humanity and teaches to his descendants. And this pattern of certain humans being selected for special education, for direct contact with the gods or the Anunnaki, this appears in multiple cultures, in the stories of culture heroes who descend from the gods or are taught by the gods and then bring civilization to humanity, teaching agriculture and writing and metallurgy and astronomy and all the arts that distinguish civilized humans from hunter-gatherers who are still living entirely within natural systems. You imagine what it must have been like for the first generations outside Eden, how they must have looked back at the place they'd been expelled from, how they must have told their children stories about the garden where food grew without labor and death didn't exist, and the gods walked among humans in the cool of the evening, and how these stories became mythology, became religion, became the foundational narratives that every culture developed to explain why life is hard, why we suffer, why we die, why we remember or long for a golden age that we can never return to. And maybe these aren't fantasies, maybe they're not wish fulfillment or primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. Maybe they're accurate memories preserved across thousands of years and hundreds of generations. Memories of a time when humanity lived under different conditions, when we had capabilities we've lost, when we were part of a system that cared for us, even while controlling us. And being expelled from that system was traumatic, was devastating, was the defining catastrophe that shaped everything that came after. And we're still living in the aftermath, still trying to recover what was lost, still reaching for the paradise we remember, but can't quite find, no matter how much technology we develop or how much knowledge we accumulate. Because maybe what we lost wasn't just a place. Maybe it was a state of consciousness, a way of being, a relationship with reality that can't be recovered through external means but requires internal transformation, requires evolving or ascending to a level where we're ready to handle the responsibilities that come with the capabilities we once had. So you sit with the expulsion narrative, and you let its implications wash through your understanding of human nature and human history. And what emerges is a picture of a species in exile, living in conditions we weren't designed for, struggling with limitations that weren't part of the original design, but which we've inherited because we're cut off from the systems that would allow us to function optimally. And the tragedy isn't that we sinned, isn't that we were disobedient. The tragedy is that we were upgraded beyond what our creators intended, and then expelled before we could learn to use our new capabilities properly. Before we could integrate the consciousness we'd gained with the biological systems we'd inherited. Before we could develop the wisdom necessary to handle the knowledge we'd accessed. And we've been trying to catch up ever since. Trying to figure out how to be conscious, autonomous beings when we were originally designed to be unconscious, obedient workers. And all of our suffering, all of our confusion, all of our existential angst comes from this mismatch between what we are and what we were meant to be. Between the consciousness we possess and the circumstances we find ourselves in. The expulsion wasn't punishment, it was quarantine. It was necessary separation to prevent humans from accessing additional capabilities before we were ready. Before we demonstrated that we could handle consciousness responsibly. And maybe the guards at Eden's gate aren't there to punish us, but to protect us. To prevent us from returning before we've evolved enough to survive what's inside. To keep us locked out until we've proven through our development as a species that we're ready to handle the technologies and knowledge that exist within the controlled environment. That we won't misuse them or destroy ourselves with them, or unleash them in ways that would harm not just humanity, but the entire planetary ecosystem, or even the wider cosmos that the Anunnaki came from. Let the weight of this possibility settle into your consciousness. Breathe into the discomfort of realizing that everything you struggle with, everything you long for, might be the result of being expelled from a system you were designed to operate within. And now you're trying to function outside that system without the manual, without support, without even clear memory of what was lost or how to get it back. Are you feeling the shape of the whole story now? Seeing how all the pieces we've examined fit together into a coherent narrative that explains not just ancient texts, but modern human experience. Not just where we came from, but why we are the way we are. Why we suffer and strive and long for something we can't quite name, but which feels like it should exist, like it once existed, like it's waiting somewhere for us to find our way back to it. We've walked through Eden from multiple perspectives. We've examined the geography and the biology and the technology that might have made it function. We've seen how different cultures preserve the same basic story with variations that illuminate different aspects of what happened. And now we have one final question to address. One last piece of the puzzle that will tie everything together and show you where all of this leads, where humanity is heading, whether we're moving toward recovery of what was lost or toward something entirely different. And that question is, where did Eden go? What happened to it physically? Does it still exist somewhere hidden, or was it destroyed in the catastrophe that ancient texts call the flood? And if it does still exist, if it's still out there somewhere sealed and guarded and waiting, what would it take for humanity to find it? What would it take for us to be allowed back inside? And would we even want to return if we could? Would we trade the freedom and autonomy we've gained for the security and longevity we lost? Or have we evolved beyond Eden? Have we become something that no longer needs the controlled environment? Something that can create its own paradise using knowledge we've rediscovered and technologies we're developing? Or are we still children playing with fire, still not ready, still dangerous to ourselves and others, still needing supervision we no longer have because our supervisors left or withdrew, or are waiting to see whether we'll destroy ourselves or transcend into whatever we're meant to become? Stay with me for one more chapter, because what we're about to explore will bring everything full circle. We'll show you the evidence for what happened to Eden after the expulsion, where researchers think it might be located today, and why the search for this place matters not just for understanding the past, but for determining the future of our species. Chapter 7. Eden after the flood. The remaining traces and the way home. You're standing on the shore of the Persian Gulf now, looking out across water that sparkles in the afternoon sun, and you're trying to imagine what this place looked like 12,000 years ago, before the ice caps melted, before sea levels rose by 400 feet, before the coastline was pushed back by hundreds of miles, and everything that existed in the fertile valley that once occupied this space was drowned under salt water that has preserved it perfectly or corroded it completely, depending on conditions we can only guess at. Geologists tell you that during the last ice age, when so much water was locked up in glaciers that ocean levels were dramatically lower than today, the Persian Gulf didn't exist as a body of water. It was a river valley, a long, fertile plain watered by the convergence of multiple rivers flowing down from the highlands to the north. And this valley would have been prime real estate for any civilization looking to establish agricultural operations or research facilities, protected by mountains on multiple sides, watered by reliable river systems, positioned at the crossroads of three continents where Africa and Asia and Europe nearly touch. And if you were going to build something important, something that needed to be accessible but defensible, something that required abundant fresh water and fertile soil and moderate climate, this valley would be an obvious choice. This would be where you'd establish your base, where you'd plant your garden, where you'd conduct your experiments with the local hominid populations and develop the worker species you needed for your mining operations or whatever other projects required intelligent labor, but not independent consciousness. The flood narratives that appear in virtually every ancient culture describe a catastrophe that drowned the world, that destroyed the civilization that existed before, that forced the survivors to start over from almost nothing. And while modern geology doesn't support a global flood that covered every mountain, the evidence for massive regional flooding at the end of the last ice age is overwhelming, as the glaciers melted and sent enormous volumes of water cascading down river valleys, as lakes that had been dammed by ice suddenly burst through their barriers and released floods of unimaginable scale that carved new landscapes and drowned everything in their path. As sea levels rose so rapidly that coastal settlements were inundated within a few generations, forcing mass migrations and creating the refugee crises that ancient texts describe as survivors fleeing the rising waters and searching for higher ground where they could rebuild. If Eden, or EDIN, was located in what's now the Persian Gulf, if it occupied the fertile valley that existed there before the sea claimed it, then the flood would have destroyed it, or at least made it inaccessible, would have buried it under sediment and salt water, would have preserved it like a time capsule if the structures were built to last. If they were constructed from materials that could survive underwater for 12,000 years, if whoever built them understood that catastrophe was coming and prepared accordingly, or would have erased it completely if the structures were organic, if they were built from materials that decompose, if they were designed to be temporary, or were simply overwhelmed by forces they weren't engineered to withstand. You feel the weight of this possibility pressing against your chest, the realization that Eden might not be lost in the sense of destroyed. It might be lost in the sense of drowned, submerged, waiting beneath water that's relatively shallow and relatively accessible if you have the resources and permission to conduct underwater archaeology in politically sensitive waters, where multiple nations have competing territorial claims, and where nobody wants foreign researchers discovering things that might complicate ownership or require rewriting history in ways that threaten established narratives about who built what and when. Take a breath. Let yourself settle into this final investigation, because what we're about to examine is the evidence for where Eden might be physically located, what traces of it might still exist, what technologies would be required to find and explore it, and why the search for this place matters not just for satisfying historical curiosity, but for understanding human origins and human potential, and possibly even for recovering knowledge that was lost when the old world drowned and the new world began, with survivors who remembered paradise but couldn't explain exactly where it had been or how to find their way back to it. The flood narrative in Genesis tells you that God decided to destroy humanity because the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And this sounds like moral judgment until you read the Sumerian version, which tells you that Enlil decided to wipe out humanity because we'd become too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep. And this isn't moral condemnation, this is annoyance. This is someone who's tired of managing an experiment that's gotten out of control, who sees an opportunity to reset everything, to use a natural catastrophe to eliminate a problem population. And the difference between the two accounts is instructive, because it shows you how the same event can be reframed, depending on who's telling the story and what theological points they're trying to make. Both accounts agree that one man was warned, was given instructions to build a boat and preserve breeding pairs of animals and survive the coming catastrophe along with his family. And both accounts describe a flood of such magnitude that it covered the mountains and destroyed everything that breathed. And while global flood geology has been discredited by evidence showing that different regions were never underwater simultaneously, the evidence for massive regional flooding is undeniable. Particularly in Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates river systems would have carried enormous volumes of meltwater from the mountains as the Ice Age ended, where the flat terrain would have allowed water to spread across vast areas with devastating effect, where any settlements in the river valleys or coastal plains would have been completely inundated. In the 1990s, marine geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman proposed what's become known as the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. They argued that around 7,600 years ago, rising Mediterranean sea levels breached the Bosporus Strait and sent a massive wall of salt water cascading into what had been a freshwater lake, raising the Black Sea level by hundreds of feet and drowning thousands of square miles of coastal settlements in a matter of weeks or months, creating exactly the kind of sudden catastrophic flood that ancient texts describe. And while the dating doesn't match the biblical timeline, it demonstrates that the kind of event described in flood narratives actually occurred in the region where these narratives originated, that people living in Mesopotamia and Anatolia really did experience floods of biblical proportions that would have seemed like the end of the world to anyone who witnessed them, that would have destroyed civilizations and forced survivors to migrate and rebuild, and would have left permanent scars in the cultural memory of every population that descended from those survivors. More recently, researchers have used bathymetric mapping and seismic surveys to examine the floor of the Persian Gulf, and what they've found is evidence of ancient river channels, of what appears to be a complete watershed system now buried under sediment and seawater. And when they computer model what the terrain would have looked like when sea levels were lower, they get a river valley that matches the biblical description surprisingly well. A valley where multiple rivers converged, where the topography would have created a natural basin suitable for large-scale agriculture, where the climate would have been moderate and rainfall reliable, where any advanced civilization looking to establish a permanent base would have found ideal conditions. And the dating of when this valley was drowned correlates roughly with the end of the last ice age, with the period when glacial melting caused rapid sea level rise worldwide, when coastlines everywhere were being pushed inland and low-lying areas were being inundated. And this timing also correlates with what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, the sudden emergence of agriculture and permanent settlements, and all the cultural developments that distinguish civilized humans from hunter-gatherers, as if the flood forced people out of the river valleys where they'd been living and pushed them to higher ground, where they had to develop new survival strategies, had to innovate or die, had to create agriculture because they no longer had access to the abundant natural resources that the fertile valleys had provided. Now, here's where the search for Eden becomes a technological and political challenge. Because if the site is underwater in the Persian Gulf, if it's buried under sediment that's been accumulating for 12,000 years, then finding it requires sophisticated sonar, and remote sensing equipment. Requires underwater drones capable of operating in conditions where visibility is poor and currents are strong. Requires excavation techniques that can work underwater without destroying fragile artifacts. And, most importantly, requires permission from the governments that control these waters. And the Persian Gulf is one of the most politically complicated bodies of water on Earth, bordered by Iran and Iraq and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and Oman. All countries with competing interests and historical grievances, and none of whom are eager to allow foreign archaeologists to conduct research that might discover something that complicates territorial claims or challenges official narratives about regional history. Several privately funded expeditions have attempted to search for Eden in the Gulf, using side-scan sonar to map the seafloor and looking for anomalies that might indicate artificial structures. And they've found things. They've found what appear to be stone formations that don't match natural geology, that show patterns suggesting intentional construction, that are located exactly where the computer models predict ancient settlements would have been. But every time they've tried to get permission to investigate further, to send down divers or submersibles to examine these structures up close, they've been denied. The governments involved have classified the findings or simply refused to issue permits. And the researchers have been forced to abandon their work or operate in secret using methods that prevent them from publishing their results in peer-reviewed journals where the academic community could evaluate the evidence. In 2008, a team led by archaeologist Jeffrey Rose announced that they'd identified what they believed was evidence of ancient settlements on the now submerged coastal plain of the Gulf, and they argued that this region, which they called the Persian Gulf Oasis, would have been a refuge during the harsh climatic conditions of the Ice Age, a place where humans could survive and thrive while much of the surrounding territory was uninhabitable. And they proposed that when sea levels rose and this oasis was drowned, the inhabitants were forced to migrate outward, carrying their knowledge and culture with them. And this diaspora could explain the sudden emergence of advanced civilizations in Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley and Egypt, all within a relatively short time period, as if they were all founded by refugees from the same source population, people who'd lost their homeland to rising waters and were trying to recreate what they'd lost in new locations, carrying memories of a paradise that had been drowned, a golden age that had ended in catastrophe. And these memories became the foundation myths of every culture they established, became the stories of Eden and Dilmun, and the land of the immortals that appear in texts from every region where these refugees settled. But here's the part that makes you question everything. If Eden was a biosphere, if it was a controlled environment with technological infrastructure, would that infrastructure survive 12,000 years underwater? Modern materials like concrete and steel degrade relatively quickly in salt water, but ancient builders used stone and bronze and materials we no longer fully understand. They built things that were designed to last not decades but millennia, and structures like the pyramids in Göbekli Tepe and the megalithic temples of Malta have survived far longer than anything modern civilization has built, have endured conditions that would destroy modern buildings, suggesting that ancient engineers understood principles of durability and longevity that we've lost or never learned. If the tree of life was technology rather than a plant, if it was a device or installation designed to extend human lifespan, would such a device still function after 12,000 years underwater? And if it does function, if it's still operational in some way, would that explain why governments are so reluctant to allow exploration of these sites? Why areas where anomalies have been detected are suddenly declared off-limits? Why researchers who get too close to finding something significant are warned away or have their funding cut or are simply prevented from publishing what they've discovered? There's another possibility, one that's even more disturbing. What if Eden wasn't drowned? What if it was evacuated before the flood? What if the Anunnaki, or whoever built it, knew the catastrophe was coming and removed the important equipment, the dangerous technology, the installations that couldn't be allowed to fall into human hands? And what if what's underwater in the Gulf is just the outer structures, just the buildings and walls and irrigation systems, while the real prize, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge, and whatever other capabilities existed inside the inner sanctuary, were taken away to somewhere else, to a location that's still guarded, that's still off-limits, that appears in ancient texts as the place where the gods withdrew after the flood, the mountain of assembly, the garden of the immortals, the locations that are described in mythology, but which might have real coordinates if you knew how to decode the geographical information that's been preserved in texts that were never meant to be read as literal maps, but which contain enough accurate detail that someone with the right knowledge could theoretically find these places if they looked in the right locations with the right equipment and the right permissions. Permissions that are almost impossible to obtain, because whoever controls these sites understands that what's there can't be revealed, can't be shared, can't be allowed into public knowledge because the implications would be too destabilizing, would undermine too many established institutions, would force too many questions that current power structures aren't prepared to answer. Throughout history, there have been individuals and groups who claimed to know where Eden is located, who said they'd found it, or been shown it, or received revelations about its coordinates. And some of these claims are obviously fraudulent, attempts to gain fame or funding or religious authority, but others are more difficult to dismiss, particularly when they come from credible researchers who had nothing to gain and much to lose by making such claims. In the 19th century, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard, who excavated Nineveh and recovered thousands of cuneiform tablets from ancient Assyrian libraries, wrote in his private journals that local informants had told him about ruins in the marshlands of southern Iraq that matched descriptions of EDIN, structures made of stone that were far older than anything that should exist in that region. But when he tried to investigate, he was prevented by the Ottoman authorities, who controlled the territory at the time, and he died before he could return to search for what he'd been told about. And his journals describing these conversations were suppressed by his executors, and only published decades later, when most of the people involved were dead and couldn't be questioned about what they'd actually seen or been told. In the 1920s, archaeologist Leonard Woolley, excavating at in southern Iraq, discovered a thick layer of water-laid clay separating the earliest cultural remains from even older settlements beneath, and he initially claimed this was evidence of Noah's flood, physical proof that a catastrophic inundation had destroyed the civilization that existed before the one we recognize as the beginning of recorded history. But he was forced to retract this interpretation under pressure from academic institutions that didn't want flood narratives treated as historical events, didn't want the Bible validated by archaeological evidence, preferred to maintain the separation between mythology and science, between faith and evidence, even when the evidence seemed to support what the ancient texts described. More recent researchers have been more cautious about making public claims, but privately, in conferences and conversations that don't get recorded or published, there are archaeologists and geologists who will tell you that they've seen things in the Gulf region, anomalies on sonar scans, formations on satellite images, structures that don't match known ancient architecture, but which appear too regular to be natural geological features. And these same researchers will tell you that when they've tried to investigate further, when they've applied for permits or funding or institutional support, they've been shut down, warned off, told explicitly or implicitly that this isn't an area where research is welcome, where discoveries would be acceptable, where the truth is something that anyone wants revealed. You imagine what it must be like to be one of these researchers, to have evidence of something extraordinary, something that could rewrite human history, and to be prevented from investigating it. To know that the answers are there, waiting to be found, but that the political and academic structures that control access to these sites have decided that some questions shouldn't be asked, some discoveries shouldn't be made, some truths are better left buried under water and sediment and official silence. And you wonder what they know that makes them so desperate to keep the lid on. What they think would happen if Eden were found, if its location were confirmed, if the technologies inside could be recovered and studied, and possibly even reactivated, and whether their caution is justified. Whether there really are dangers lurking in those ancient ruins that we're not ready to handle. Or whether the real danger is to their authority, to their control over the narrative, to their ability to tell us who we are and where we came from and what we're capable of becoming. So you step back from the search for Eden's physical location, from the political complications and technological challenges, and you ask yourself what it means that we're still looking. That thousands of years after the expulsion, after countless generations have lived and died, never knowing paradise, we're still searching for it, still believing it exists somewhere, still thinking that if we could just find the right location, decipher the right texts, dig in the right places, we might recover what was lost, might gain access to the knowledge and capabilities that our ancestors had before the catastrophe that reset everything. This persistent searching reveals something fundamental about human nature, about the way we carry within us a sense that something is missing, that we're living in diminished circumstances, that we're capable of more than we currently achieve, that somewhere in our past there was a time when things were different, when we lived differently, when we had access to knowledge and technologies and states of consciousness that we've lost, but which we remember, not consciously perhaps, not in our individual memories, but in our collective cultural memory, in the stories we tell ourselves about golden ages and falls from grace and paradises lost and redemptions promised. Maybe the search for Eden is ultimately a search for ourselves, for our full potential as a species, for the capabilities we possess but don't know how to activate, for the knowledge that's encoded in our DNA but which we can't access because we no longer live in the environment or have access to the technologies that would allow those genetic programs to express, and maybe finding Eden physically, locating its ruins under the Persian Gulf or in the highlands of Armenia or wherever it actually is, maybe that's less important than recovering what Eden represents, the state of consciousness it symbolized, the relationship with reality it made possible, the integration of knowledge and capability and wisdom that would allow us to be fully human in ways we currently aren't, that would let us express the potential that was built into us when we were created, or modified, or upgraded, potential that remains dormant, waiting for conditions that would allow it to activate, waiting for us to evolve or ascend to the point where we're ready to handle what we lost when Eden was sealed and we were cast out into a world that was beautiful and terrible, but fundamentally not what we were designed for. Let that understanding settle into your bones. Breathe into the mystery of it. Because whether Eden exists as a physical location or only as a memory, as an archetype, as a possibility that beckons to us from the depths of time, the fact that we remember it, the fact that every culture preserves some version of this story, suggests it represents something true about human origins and human destiny, something we need to understand if we're ever going to fully become what we're meant to be. And if this journey has moved something in you, if these 7 chapters have opened your mind to possibilities you hadn't considered, if you're feeling that uncomfortable excitement that comes when old certainties crack and new questions emerge, then I want to ask you to do something. Hit the like button on this video, because that simple action tells the algorithm that this story matters, that these questions deserve to be heard. But there are people out there hungry for truth, even when it's uncomfortable. And it helps this channel reach others who are searching for the same answers you've been searching for. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel, save this video to your playlist so you can return to it whenever you need to remember what we've discovered together, and share it with someone who's ready to question everything they've been taught. Because what we've explored tonight about Eden is just the beginning. It's one thread in a much larger tapestry of forgotten history and suppressed knowledge and questions that mainstream institutions don't want you asking. Because here's what we haven't talked about yet. Here's the question that follows naturally from everything we've discovered about Eden. If the Anunnaki, or the Elohim, or whatever you want to call them, created humans in Eden, if they modified our genetics and gave us consciousness we weren't supposed to have, then who were they? Where did they come from? And most importantly, are they still here? The ancient texts have another name for them, a name that appears in every culture from Mesopotamia to Greece to the Hebrew Bible. They're called the Watchers. And according to the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, and texts that were deliberately excluded from Scripture, the Watchers didn't just create humans in Eden. They stayed after the expulsion. They fell in love with human women. They bred with us. They taught us forbidden knowledge about metallurgy and cosmetics and warfare and astronomy, skills we weren't supposed to have, technologies that accelerated human development in ways that weren't part of the plan. And they were punished for it. The texts say they were bound and imprisoned in dark places until the day of judgment. But what if that's not the whole story? What if the Watchers are still here? What if they never left? What if they've been watching and waiting and working behind the scenes of human history for thousands of years? And what if everything we're experiencing now, the rapid acceleration of technology, the sudden emergence of artificial intelligence, the way our world is being transformed faster than we can comprehend? What if all of this is connected to them? What if the Watchers are preparing for something, and what if we're running out of time to understand what's really happening before it's too late? In the next video, we're going deep into the most controversial text that almost made it into your Bible, the Book of Enoch. And we're going to ask the question that nobody wants to answer. Were the Watchers really fallen angels? Or were they something else entirely? Were they the same beings who built Eden? Were they Anunnaki who broke ranks and decided to help humanity even though it violated every protocol? And if they were imprisoned, as the texts claim, who imprisoned them? Where are they now? And what happens when they get out? We're going to examine evidence that these beings might still be active, might be manipulating human development from the shadows, might be the real force behind technological breakthroughs that seem to come out of nowhere, breakthroughs in genetics and artificial intelligence and quantum computing that are transforming our species faster than evolution should allow. And we're going to connect dots that will make you see human history in a completely different light. Will make you question whether we're really in control of our own development or whether someone else is pulling the strings, guiding us toward a destination we can't see yet, but which the Watchers have been planning for millennia. The story is called The Watchers. Were they really fallen angels? And if what we discovered about Eden shook your understanding of human origins, wait until you see what the texts say about what happened after we left the garden, because the Watchers changed everything. And their story is still unfolding right now in ways you can see if you know what to look for. In the technologies we're developing, in the direction civilization is heading, in the choices we're making about artificial intelligence and genetic engineering and the future of consciousness itself. And maybe the Watchers are why we're having these conversations now. Maybe they're why you're here, listening to this. Maybe they've been preparing humanity for thousands of years for a moment that's approaching faster than anyone realizes. And that moment, that transformation, that revelation, it's waiting for you in the next video. And I promise you, nothing will be the same after you hear what the Book of Enoch has to say about who's really been running this world and what they want from us, and what role humanity is meant to play in whatever's coming next. Sleep now. Let your mind rest. Let the information integrate without effort, and know that the journey doesn't end here. It never ends. Each answer reveals new questions. Each discovery points toward deeper mysteries. And maybe that's exactly as it should be. Maybe the search for Eden is meant to pull us forward, meant to ensure that we never stop questioning and searching, and reaching for something higher, something better. Something that approaches what we lost, or what we're meant to become. And as you drift into sleep now, as your consciousness relaxes and expands into dreams, Remember that you carry Eden within you. It's encoded in your DNA. It's waiting in the dormant structures of your brain. It's accessible in states of consciousness you haven't learned to reach yet, but you will. Because that's what we're doing here. That's what this channel is for. We're learning together how to remember what we've forgotten, how to activate what's been dormant, how to become what we were always meant to be. And if that's a journey you want to continue, then I'll see you in the next video, where the mystery deepens, where the questions get more dangerous, where the truth becomes harder to deny, and where together we'll keep searching for answers that the world doesn't want us to find. Sleep well, traveler, and may your dreams show you the path home, and may the watchers, wherever they are, recognize in you someone who's ready to understand, ready to remember, ready to become what humanity was always meant to be. And when you wake, when morning comes, the next chapter of this story will be waiting, and I'll be here, ready to walk with you deeper into the mystery, deeper into the truth, deeper into the forgotten history that explains everything about where we came from and where we're going and why we're here at this particular moment in human history when the old world is ending and something new is being born. And you're part of that birth, you're part of that transformation, and the watchers are waiting to see what you'll do with the knowledge you've gained, with the consciousness you've expanded, with the potential you're only beginning to recognize. So rest now, dream now, and I'll see you on the other side, in the next video, where the real story begins.